The wind did not howl, it merely breathed, a long, low exhalation that had begun centuries ago and had never truly ceased. It was a wind of deep, heavy indigo, a current of air that carried the weight of the northern ice, pressing against the hewn logs of the cabin with a persistence that was neither malicious nor kind. It simply was. The cabin sat anchored in the snow, a small, dark shape against the vast, pale gray of the sleeping forest. Inside, the darkness was absolute, a thick velvet texture that filled the corners and settled over the single room like a heavy woolen blanket. The air within was still, held in a suspended state of frigidity, only slightly warmer than the biting frost that coated the exterior world. It was the hour before dawn, that deeply silent span of time when the world seems to have stopped turning, paused in a deep, frozen slumber. In the center of the room, the hearth was a sleeping eye, covered in a thick eyelid of gray ash. Beneath that layer of exhausted wood, a single ember pulsed, a faint, dying heart of dull orange that offered no heat, only the memory of fire. The darkness of the room was painted in shades of charcoal and midnight blue, the shadows soft and grainy, blurring the edges of the rough wooden furniture. A table, heavy and scarred by years of use, stood silent near the window. A chair, its back straight and unforgiving, waited in the gloom. The shelves that lined the far wall were filled with jars and bundles, their contents hidden in the shadows, vague shapes of dried leaves, twisted roots, and glass containers that caught the faintest glint of the non-existent light. The sleeper lay beneath a mound of furs and quilts, a stillness within the stillness. The breathing was shallow, a rhythmic rising and falling that misted the freezing air above the bed. The cold was a physical presence in the room, a guest that had entered through the cracks in the chinking, through the gaps around the doorframe, settling on the floorboards and creeping up the legs of the bed. It was a cold that smelled of old wood, of dried pine needles, and of the metallic tang of snow that has fallen for days without end. The sleeper moved, a slow, heavy shift of weight, the furs rustling with a sound like dry leaves skittering over stone. It was time. The internal clock, tuned to the slow rotation of the winter stars, chimed silently in the blood. One hand emerged from the warmth of the bedding. The skin was weathered, mapped with the lines of years and labor, the knuckles swollen with the cold. It reached out into the biting air, grasping the rough texture of the blanket's edge. The transition from the cocoon of sleep to the reality of the frozen morning was not sudden. It was a slow, deliberate acceptance of discomfort. The healer pushed the covers back, the heavy wool and fur rolling away to reveal the biting chill of the room. The air hit the skin like a damp cloth, heavy and numbing. Sitting up took time. The joints complained, stiffened by the damp cold that permeated the cabin, a stiffness that mirrored the frozen sap in the trees outside. The feet found the floor. The wooden planks were polished smooth by decades of footsteps, but they held the temperature of ice. The sensation traveled up the legs, a sharp reminder of the season. There was no hurry. There was never any hurry in the deep winter. To rush was to invite mistakes, and in this forest, mistakes were paid for in frostbite and silence. The healer sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, the shoulders hunched under the thin linen shirt, head bowed. The breath plumed out in distinct gray clouds, dissipating slowly into the stagnant air. The silence of the cabin was dense, broken only by the settling of the timbers, a sharp crack that echoed like a pistol shot in the quiet, then faded instantly back into the void. The first task was the fire. It was always the fire. Without it, the day could not begin, the body could not function. The healer stood, the knees popping, and moved through the darkness with the surety of one who has walked this path 10,000 times. The darkness was not empty, it was textured. The hand brushed against the rough surface of the table, felt the cold smoothness of a clay pitcher, touched the back of the wooden chair. Every object had a place, and every place was known by touch. Kneeling before the hearth was an act of reverence. The stone of the hearth was cold enough to burn the skin. The ash was soft, distinct, like fine flour. With a small iron poker, the healer gently, slowly, pushed aside the gray blanket of ash. The motion was microscopic, careful not to smother the faint life that remained. There it was, the ember, a tiny, glowing jewel of dark red struggling against the encroaching death of the cold. It pulsed, fading and brightening in time with the subtle currents of air in the room. The healer reached for the small pile of birch bark kept dry in a niche of the stone chimney. The bark was papery, thin as onion skin. A piece was torn off, the sound sharp in the quiet. It was placed gently, so gently, upon the dying ember. Then the breath. The healer leaned in, lips pursed, and blew a thin, steady stream of air onto the coal. The glow brightened. It shifted from dull red to a fierce orange, then to a blinding yellow-white at the very center. The birch bark curled, blackened, and then with a tiny, audible F-whoosh, a small tongue of blue flame licked upward. It was a fragile thing, this new fire. It danced nervously, casting long, wavering shadows against the stones of the hearth. The light it cast was weak, a soft, pastel glow that barely reached the healer's hands, turning the skin a sallow yellow against the surrounding blue-gray dark. More bark was added, then small twigs of dry spruce which snapped and popped as the heat touched them. The smell of resin began to fill the small space near the floor, a sharp, clean scent that cut through the stale cold. The fire grew, eating the wood with a quiet hunger. The light expanded, pushing the heavy blue shadows back toward the corners of the room. It revealed the texture of the floorboards, the grain of the wood standing out in high relief. It caught the edges of the drying herbs hanging from the rafters, turning them into grotesque, hanging shapes that swayed slightly in the thermal updraft. The healer remained nailing, hands extended toward the growing warmth. The palms were calloused, the fingers long and stained with the juices of roots and berries. The heat was a physical weight pressing against the skin, warring with the cold that pressed from behind. It was a battle fought every morning, a silent war between the small circle of life and the vast, indifferent winter. Slowly, the numbness in the fingers began to recede, replaced by a dull ache as the blood returned to the capillaries. The fire crackled, a comforting, domestic sound that seemed out of place in such a desolate landscape. Standing up required effort. The back uncurled, the spine adjusting to the vertical. The room was now dimly lit, a chiaroscuro painting of deep shadows and warm highlights. The visual quality of the scene was soft, as if viewed through a layer of gauze. The colors were muted, browns of the wood, grays of the stone, deep indigos of the shadows, and the warm, buttery yellow of the firelight. There were no sharp edges. Everything was worn down, softened by time and use. The healer moved to the wash basin. The water in the pitcher had a thin crust of ice on top. The knuckles broke it with a crunch. The water was shockingly cold, stealing the breath from the lungs as it was splashed onto the face. It was a ritual of awakening, a way to sharpen the senses before the work began. Drying the face with a rough linen towel, the healer looked toward the window. The glass was thick, distorted, and almost entirely opaque with frost. The frost patterns were intricate fern-like structures of white crystal that grew across the pane, a frozen garden that blocked out the world. Through the small patches of clear glass, only a dark, heavy gray could be seen. The dawn was coming, but it was slow, dragging itself over the horizon with reluctance. The forest outside was a mystery, a wall of silence waiting to be breached. Now the dressing. This was a process of layering, of constructing a fortress against the elements. The healer moved to the chest at the foot of the bed. The wood of the chest was cedar, and opening it released a scent that mingled pleasantly with the wood smoke. First came the socks, thick woolen things, knitted from yarn that had not been dyed, retaining the natural oils of the sheep to repel moisture. They were pulled on slowly, one by one, over the pale, cold feet. The wool was scratchy but warm, a rough embrace. Next, the trousers of heavy, felted wool, dark gray and stiff. They were fastened with a leather thong, the knot tied with practiced ease. A tunic of lighter wool was pulled over the head, followed by a vest of sheepskin, the fur turned inward. The vest was old, the leather cracked in places, but it trapped the body heat effectively. Every layer added weight, restricting movement slightly, turning the healer into a heavy, padded figure. The boots were next. They stood by the door, tall and sturdy, made of thick, treated leather that smelled of tallow and beeswax. The leather was stiff from the cold, resisting the foot. The healer had to work the foot in, pushing and twisting until the heel seated itself. The laces were leather strips, hard and unyielding. Tying them required strength in the fingers, pulling them tight until the boot felt like a part of the leg. The process was slow, methodical, a meditation on preparation. The healer stood fully shod, the boots thudding heavily on the floorboards. The weight of the clothing was comforting, a protective shell, but the preparation was not complete. The outer layer was the most important. The cloak hung on a peg by the door. It was a massive garment woven from the coarsest wool, dyed a deep, dark forest green that appeared black in the low light. It was lined with rabbit fur, a patchwork of pelts stitched together years ago. The healer lifted it down. It was heavy, weighing as much as a small child. Swinging it around the shoulders, the weight settled, pressing down, grounding the healer to the floor. The clasp was a piece of polished antler, cool to the touch. With the cloak secured, the hood was pulled up. It extended far past the face, creating a tunnel of vision, a private space of warm air in front of the nose and mouth. The world was now narrowed to what lay directly ahead. The peripheral vision was gone, replaced by the dark, fuzzy texture of the wool. The healer breathed, and the breath was caught in the fur of the hood, warming the face. The tools of the trade were gathered next. A leather satchel, stained and worn, was slung over one shoulder. Inside, the glass jars clinked softly, muffled by the wrapping of rags. A knife, its handle made of bone, smoothed to a shine by decades of grip, was sheathed at the belt. The blade was carbon steel, dark and prone to rust, requiring constant care. It had been sharpened the night before, the edge keen enough to shave the hair from an arm. A small hand axe was added to the belt, its weight balancing the knife. Finally, the basket. It was woven from willow, darkened by age and exposure. It was large, deep, and strapped to the back, leaving the hands free. The healer stood in the center of the room, fully equipped. The fire was burning steadily now, a bed of coals establishing itself. It would need to be banked before leaving, covered with ash to preserve the heat for the return, but not yet. For a moment, the healer simply stood, listening. The wind outside had shifted. It was no longer a steady stream, but a gusting, rhythmic buffeting that shook the eaves of the cabin. The timber groaned. The snow hissed against the walls, a sound like sand being thrown against the wood. It was a hostile world out there, a world that did not care for the warmth of blood or the beating of a heart. The healer moved to the table and picked up a piece of dried meat and a hard biscuit. This was breakfast, eaten standing up, chewing slowly. The food was dry, flavorless, merely fuel for the furnace of the body. The jaw worked rhythmically. The eyes stared at the frosted window, not seeing the ice but seeing the map of the forest in the mind. The path today would be long. The herbs needed: the wintergreen, the buried roots of the echinacea, the rare frozen moss from the north side of the ancient oaks, grew in the deep hollows, places where the snow drifted deep, and the shadows never really lifted. The banking of the fire was a sad task. To cover the warmth, to hide the light, felt like a betrayal. The healer shoveled the gray ash back over the vibrant orange coals. The light in the room died down, returning the space to the deep blue gloom of the pre-dawn. The shadows lengthened and merged, swallowing the furniture. The room became cold again, visually, even if the heat lingered in the air. The smell of smoke was strong, clinging to the wool of the cloak. The healer walked to the door. The wood of the door was thick oak, bound with iron straps. The handle was iron, wrapped in leather to prevent the skin from freezing to the metal. The healer's hand, now covered in a thick mitten of knitted wool, grasped the handle. There was a pause, a hesitation. To open the door was to break the seal, to let the winter in, to surrender the sanctuary. It was a threshold not just of space, but of state of being. Inside there was safety. Outside there was only the task. The latch clicked. It was a loud, metallic sound in the silence. The healer pushed. The door stuck, frozen to the frame by the moisture of the night. A shoulder was applied, a heave of the heavy body. The ice cracked with a sharp report, and the door swung inward. The wind did not wait. It lunged into the room, a physical force, swirling the ash on the hearth, billowing the cloak, stinging the exposed skin of the face. The temperature dropped instantly. The air that entered was crisp, dry, and painfully cold. It smelled of ozone and ice. The healer stepped out onto the small porch, pulling the door shut against the wind. The latch clicked home. The cabin was sealed. The world outside was a study in monochromatic blue. The sky was a heavy slate color, indistinguishable from the horizon. The trees were black skeletons, their branches etched against the sky in charcoal strokes. The snow was everywhere, a luminous pale blue blanket that covered the earth, smoothing out the roughness of the terrain, hiding the rocks and the roots. It was deep, piled high against the cabin walls, drifting up to the windowsill. The wind kicked up plumes of snow dust, ghost-like figures that danced across the clearing and dissolved into the trees. The healer stood on the porch, adjusting to the assault. The cold found the gaps in the layers immediately, the space between the scarf and the chin, the wrists, the knees. The body reacted, the muscles tightening, the shivering reflex held in check by will. The breath smoked furiously, a white dragon exhausted into the gale. The sound of the forest was a roar, the wind tearing through the pine needles, the branches clashing together like dry bones. The first step off the porch was a commitment. The snow crunched loudly under the boot, a sound that was both muffled and distinct. The texture of the snow was dry, powdery. It did not pack, it flowed like sugar. The healer sank in up to the shin. The second step, the third, the rhythm began to establish itself. Lift, place, shift, weight. Lift, place, shift, weight. The movement was slow, hypnotic. The heavy cloak dragged in the snow, leaving a wide, smooth track behind, erasing the individual footprints. The healer headed towards the tree line. The forest wall was dense, a barrier of dark trunks and shadowed spaces. The path was known only by memory. The snow had erased all trails. The destination was the northern ridge, a place of rocky outcrops and ancient wind, where the specific herbs required for the fever tincture grew. It was miles away. The journey would take hours. As the healer entered the trees, the wind dropped slightly, broken by the density of the timber. The roar became a sigh. The light was dimmer here, the canopy of pine and spruce blocking the faint ambient light of the sky. It was like entering a cathedral, a vast, silent space of vertical lines and vaulted ceilings. The air was stiller but colder if that was possible. It was a damp, settling cold that seeped from the ancient trunks. The visual landscape shifted. The broad strokes of the clearing gave way to intricate details. The bark of the pines was textured, rough and scaly, dusted with snow in the crevices. The hanging moss was frozen into stiff gray beards. The shadows were absolute black, pools of ink spilled on the white snow. The lantern, which the healer had hooked to the belt but not yet lit, swung gently, its metal frame clinking against the hip. It was not needed yet. The eyes had adjusted to the gloom, seeing in the spectrum of gray and blue. The silence of the forest was heavy. It was not an absence of sound, but a presence of weight. The snow dampened everything. A branch falling a mile away would be unheard. The healer's own breathing was the loudest sound in the world, a rhythmic, raspy intake and the soft whoosh of the exhale. The heart beat slow and steady, a drum in the ears. The walking was hard work. The snow concealed hidden hollows and fallen logs. Every step had to be tested. The boots were heavy, acting as anchors. The muscles of the thighs burned with the effort of lifting the legs high to clear the drift. The healer did not stop. Stopping was dangerous. To stop was to let the cold win. The movement generated heat, kept the blood flowing to the extremities. The healer reached a small stream. It was frozen solid, a ribbon of white winding through the trees. The ice was thick but treacherous. In places, the black water could be seen moving sluggishly beneath the surface. The healer paused, looking for the crossing. A fallen log, slick with ice, bridged the gap. It was a test of balance. The healer approached it slowly. The wood of the log was rotten, covered in a thick layer of moss and ice. Placing a hand on the rough bark of a nearby birch to steady the ascent, the healer stepped onto the log. The boots gripped the frozen wood uncertainly. The water below gurgled, a dark, throaty sound. The wind pushed at the cloak, trying to unbalance the figure. The healer moved inch by inch, sliding the feet rather than lifting them. The focus was absolute. The world narrowed down to the next 6 inches of wood. The texture of the log was visible in extreme detail. The lichens, the cracks, the crystals of ice embedded in the grain. Safely on the other side, the healer exhaled a long, shaky breath. The path continued upward now, the ground rising toward the ridge. The trees began to change, the pines giving way to hardwoods, oaks and maples that stood naked and shivering in the wind. Their branches were like intricate lace against the sky, which was slowly, very slowly beginning to lighten. The deep indigo was fading to a bruised purple, then to a cold, steel gray. The temperature seemed to drop as the sun approached the horizon, the dawn chill that freezes the sap. The healer pulled the cloak tighter, the wool scratching against the cheek. The numb fingers curled inside the mittens. The mind drifted, detaching from the physical discomfort, entering a trance state of endurance. This was the gatherer's walk. 1 foot, then the other. The snow, the wind, the trees, the silence. The healer passed a large boulder, a glacial erratic dropped by ice eons ago. It was covered in a thick blanket of moss, now frozen hard as stone. On the leeward side of the rock, the snow was scooped out, creating a small shelter. Animal tracks were visible there, the tiny, delicate prints of a hare, the purposeful line of a fox. They were recent, the edges of the prints still sharp. Life continued here, hidden, desperate, enduring. The healer noted them without breaking stride. The incline steepened. The breath came harder now, short gasps of freezing air that burned the throat. The legs were heavy, leaden. The basket on the back creaked with every step. The healer leaned forward, using gravity to assist the ascent. The hands grabbed at saplings to pull the weight up. The texture of the bark was rough through the wool of the mittens. Finally, the trees began to thin. The ridge was ahead. The wind returned with renewed ferocity, no longer blocked by the canopy. It shrieked over the rocks, carrying ice crystals that stung the face like needles. The healer lowered the head, presenting the hood to the gale. The light was brighter here, a harsh, flat gray light that offered no warmth. The sky was a vast, indifferent expanse. The healer stopped. This was the first gathering place, a patch of rocky ground swept clear of snow by the wind. Here, clinging to the frozen earth, were the low bushes of winterberry. The red berries were shriveled, hard as pebbles, but they held the heat of the summer sun locked inside their frozen skins. They were vital. The healer knelt in the snow. The movement was stiff, the knees cracking. The wind whipped the cloak around the kneeling form, a dark shape huddled against the earth. The mittens were pulled off, revealing the pale, gloved hands beneath. The gloves were thinner leather, allowing for dexterity but offering less protection. The cold seized the fingers instantly. The healer reached out. The fingers brushed the frozen twigs. The berries were cold, hard beads. With a small pair of iron shears taken from the satchel, the healer began to clip the stems. Snip, snip, snip. The sound was tiny against the wind. The berries fell into the waiting basket, a soft rattle. The process was slow. Each stem was inspected. Only the best were taken. The rest were left for the birds for the winter. The cold crept up the arms, bypassing the layers of wool. The fingers began to stiffen, to lose their sensation. The healer worked faster, the movements becoming jerky. The wind was a constant pressure, a hand pushing against the back. The light was static, frozen in the perpetual gray of the morning. After what seemed like an hour but was perhaps only minutes, the healer stopped. Enough. The bush must not be stripped. Balance must be maintained. The mittens were pulled back on, a struggle with numb hands. The healer stood, the joints locking, the body protesting the cold. The basket was heavier now, not by much, but every ounce counted. The healer looked out over the ridge. Below, the forest stretched away endlessly, a sea of white and black and gray. No smoke rose from any chimney. No movement broke the stillness. It was a dead world, beautiful in its desolation. The healer turned away from the view, turning back to the slope. The journey was not over, it had only just begun. The next sight was further, deeper, colder. The wind pushed and the healer walked, a solitary dark scratch on the face of the winter. The rhythm resumed. The silence returned. The cold remained. The descent from the ridge was a slow surrender to gravity. The wind, which had been a violent companion on the exposed heights, began to lose its voice as the healer moved back into the embrace of the timber. It did not disappear, but rather changed its character, transforming from a shrieking gale into a low, mournful moaning that threaded itself through the upper branches of the pines. The transition was gradual, a fading of auditory sharpness into a muffled, cotton-wrapped quiet. The slope was steep, a treacherous angle of decline hidden beneath the deceptive smoothness of the snow. Every step was a negotiation with the terrain. The healer placed a boot, testing the surface tension of the crust. Sometimes it held, supporting the weight for a fleeting second before collapsing with a dry crunch. Sometimes it gave way immediately, the leg plunging down into the powder, the body pitching forward, caught only by the drag of the heavy cloak and the counterbalance of the basket. The light had shifted again. The gray dawn had fully established itself, but it was a light without warmth, a flat, dimensional illumination that seemed to sap the color from the world. The trees here were different from those in the valley below or the ridge above. They were ancient hemlocks, their trunks massive and dark, columns of textured charcoal rising into the pale void of the sky. The bark was deeply furrowed, the ridges catching the driven snow in vertical stripes of white, creating a pattern of stark contrast that dizzying to look at for too long. The lower branches were dead, sticking out like broken limbs, brittle and sharp, ready to snag the wool of the cloak. The healer moved with a weaving motion, a slow slalom between the trunks, the hands constantly raised to ward off the grasping twigs. The air in this hollow was heavier, denser. It felt older, as if it had sat in this depression of the earth for 1,000 years, undisturbed by the currents of the upper atmosphere. It carried the scent of deep earth, of decaying wood, and the sharp, medicinal tang of crushed needles. The cold here was a damp thing. It did not bite like the wind on the ridge, it soaked. It permeated the layers of wool and leather, finding the skin and clinging to it like a wet sheet. The healer could feel the moisture in the breath condensing on the inside of the scarf, creating a ring of damp ice against the lips and chin. It was uncomfortable, a constant, gritty irritation, but there was no remedy for it. To remove the scarf was to invite frostbite. To keep it was to endure the wet cold. The healer chose endurance. The path leveled out at the bottom of the ravine. Here the snow was deep, undisturbed by the wind. It lay in soft, undulating mounds, mimicking the topography of the forest floor, the fallen logs, the boulders, the pits and mounds of uprooted trees from storms past. The surface was pristine, a sheet of textured paper waiting for the mark of the charcoal. The healer's tracks were deep, dragging furrows that disrupted the perfection. The sound of movement changed here. On the ridge, the wind had masked the footsteps. Here in the stillness, the sound was magnified. The crunch of the snow was loud, a rhythmic crushing of crystals that echoed softly against the tree trunks. The creak of the leather straps on the basket was a rhythmic counterpoint, a leather heartbeat. Crunch, creak, crunch, creak. The destination in this hollow was a specific tree, a dead giant that had fallen decades ago and was now slowly returning to the earth. It lay like the spine of a buried dragon, a ridge of moss and snow that stretched for 50 feet through the gloom. The healer knew this tree. It was a landmark, but also a garden. In the rotting wood of its underside, protected from the deepest freeze, grew the ghost pipes and the specialized fungi needed for the respiratory salve. Finding it required reading the landscape, looking for the specific hump in the snow that signified the root ball. There it was, a massive shadowy mound rising from the white floor. The upturned roots were a chaotic sculpture of dark wood and stone, grasping at the air like frozen fingers. The healer approached slowly, the snow rising to the knees. The work here would be delicate. The gloves were too thick for the tactile sensitivity required. The healer stopped, standing in the shadow of the root ball. The breath plumed out, a cloud of gray against the black wood. The silence was absolute. No birds sang. No squirrels chattered. The forest was in a coma. The healer removed the heavy outer mittens, clipping them to the belt with a practiced twist. The inner gloves, thin leather stained with the oils of 1,000 plants, were exposed to the air. The cold pounced immediately, tightening the skin across the knuckles, stealing the warmth from the fingertips. The healer ignored it, focusing on the task. Reaching into the satchel, a tool was produced. It was not a trowel, but a scraper, a flat, curved piece of elk bone, sharpened on one edge. Metal was too harsh for this work. It would damage the delicate structures of the fungi. Kneeling was difficult. The snow had to be packed down, a platform created for the knees. The healer stamped, turning in a small circle, compressing the powder until it would support the weight. Then the descent. The knees hit the packed snow, the cold shooting up the thighs. The healer leaned forward, entering the small, sheltered cave formed by the overhang of the fallen trunk. It was darker here, a deep, velvety gloom. The smell of rot was strong, a sweet, cloying scent of wet wood and mold that was strangely pleasant in the sterile winter air. The healer brought the lantern around, though it was still unlit. The glass and metal were cold enough to burn. Using a small flint and steel from a pouch, the healer struck a spark. It took 3 tries, the cold fingers clumsy on the steel. The spark caught the charred cloth, glowing red. The healer blew, the glow intensifying, then touched it to the wick. The flame caught, small and yellow. The lantern was closed. The light it cast was warm, a soft amber sphere that pushed back the blue shadows. It illuminated the underside of the log. There they were, tiny, pale shapes growing from the dark, crumbling wood. They looked like frozen drops of milk, fragile and translucent. The frost fungi. They grew only in the deepest winter, feeding on the dying energies of the wood. The healer brought the bone scraper to the first cluster. The movement was microscopic. The edge of the bone slid under the fungal mass, separating it from the wood with a soft, tearing sound. The fungus was lifted, balanced on the blade, and transferred to a small wooden box lined with moss. It was placed gently, like a jewel. The process was repeated: scrape, lift, place. The healer worked with a single-minded focus, the eyes narrowing in the lantern light. The world outside the small sphere of amber light ceased to exist. There was only the wood, the bone, the fungus, and the cold. The cold was a creeping paralysis. It started in the toes, which were now numb blocks of wood in the boots. It moved up the legs, a dull ache in the bones. It worked into the fingers, making them stiff and unresponsive. The healer had to stop every few minutes to flex the hands, to blow warm breath into the cupped palms. The breath fogged the air, swirling in the lantern light before vanishing. A spiderweb, frozen and frosted, hung in the corner of the hollow. Each strand was thickened with ice, a glittering necklace of diamonds that caught the lantern light. The healer avoided it carefully. To destroy such a thing seemed a crime against the stillness. The collection continued. The box filled slowly. The healer checked each specimen, discarding those that were brown or withered. Only the pure white, the viable, were kept. This was medicine. It had to be perfect. After a long time, the harvest was done. The box was closed, the lid sliding shut with a soft friction. It was wrapped in a piece of wool and placed deep in the satchel, near the body to keep it from freezing completely. The lantern was extinguished, the flame dying with a sputter. The darkness rushed back in, heavy and blue, blinding the eyes for a moment until they adjusted to the gray light of the day. The healer backed out of the hollow, the knees stiff and protesting. Standing up was a slow, unfolding process, the spine cracking audibly. The healer brushed the snow from the knees of the trousers. The crystals clung to the wool, stubborn and dry. The mittens were put back on, the hands grateful for the return to the heavy insulation. A drink of water from the skin at the belt. The water was slushy, ice crystals forming in the neck of the flask. It hurt the teeth, a sharp, piercing pain that faded slowly. The healer ate another piece of dried meat, chewing rhythmically, staring at the texture of the bark on the fallen log. The patterns of the wood grain were mesmerizing, swirling lines of growth and decay that told the story of centuries. The journey continued. The path now followed the lay of the land, drifting deeper into the valley toward the frozen creek bed. The walking was easier here on the level ground, but the snow was deeper. The healer fell into a trance-like rhythm. Step, drag, step, drag. The cloak swept the snow behind, erasing the details of the passage. The visual landscape was monotonous, vertical lines of trees, horizontal lines of shadows, the white expanse of the floor. It was a drawing in charcoal and chalk on blue paper. The creek, when it appeared, was a scar in the landscape, a wide, flat avenue of white that wound through the trees. The ice was covered in snow, but in the center, where the wind had scoured it clean, the black ice was visible. It looked like obsidian, dark and polished. The healer stepped onto the frozen bank. The sound changed again. The hollow thud of the ground was replaced by the sharp, ringing crack of the ice. Even under the snow, the ice resonated. The healer walked along the edge, keeping to the thicker ice near the shore. The sound of the creek was a living thing. Deep below the ice, the water still flowed. It gurgled and groaned, trapped in its frozen conduit. Occasionally, the ice would shift. A loud boom would echo through the valley, a sound like a cannon shot as a stress fracture opened somewhere miles away. The sound traveled through the ice, vibrating up through the soles of the boots. It was the voice of the winter, deep and resonant. The healer looked down at the ice. In the clear patches, bubbles of air were trapped in suspended animation, stacked in layers like silver coins. They were frozen moments of breath from the water below. Leaves, caught in the freeze months ago, were preserved perfectly, brown and gold specimens under glass. The healer stopped to admire a particularly large formation of bubbles, a galaxy of silver spheres frozen in the black void. It was beautiful, a silent, cold art that no one else would ever see. The wind picked up again as the valley widened. It blew down the channel of the creek, a funnel for the cold air. It caught the cloak, billowing it out like a sail. The healer leaned into it, head down. The destination was a grove of black willows that grew in the bend of the creek, a mile downstream. The bark of the black willow was the prize there. It contained the pain relief, the salicin. The walking became harder. The wind on the creek was fierce, carrying ice pellets that scoured the exposed skin of the face. The healer pulled the hood forward, narrowing the aperture of vision to a small circle of white and gray. The eyes watered, the tears freezing on the lashes, gluing them together. The healer had to blink forcefully to clear them. The sensation of the cold was a heavy, dull pressure on the forehead, a headache that sat behind the eyes and would not leave. The rhythm of the steps became the only reality. Left, right, left, right. The basket weighed heavily on the shoulders, the straps digging into the muscle even through the layers of wool. The healer shifted the weight, hunching the shoulders, but the relief was temporary. The body was a machine, fueled by will and habit. The mind detached, floating somewhere above the frozen scene, watching the small, dark figure trudge through the vast whiteness. The willows appeared as a haze of yellow-gray branches in the distance. They were distinct from the dark pines and the gray oaks. Their branches were thin, whip-like, coloring the air with a faint golden hue. They grew close to the water, their roots drinking deep from the saturated soil. The healer approached them with a sense of relief. It was a destination, a marker of progress. Reaching the grove, the healer dropped the pack into the snow. The relief was instantaneous, the shoulders floating upward as the weight was removed. The healer stretched, the back popping. The wind whistled through the willow branches, a high-pitched, singing sound that was different from the roar of the pines. It was a thin, reedy music. The branches clashed together, clicking like knitting needles. The healer selected a tree. It was not the largest nor the smallest, but one with smooth, unblemished bark on the southern side. The knife was drawn. The blade was cold, the steel gray and dull in the flat light. The healer did not strip the tree. That would kill it. Instead, a small vertical incision was made, then another parallel to the first. The knife tip was inserted and a strip of bark was peeled away. It came off with a tearing sound, revealing the pale, wet wood beneath. The inner bark was green, smelling of bitter almond and aspirin. The scent was sharp, cutting through the cold air. The healer cut the strip into smaller squares, stacking them in the hand. The wood beneath was already beginning to freeze, the moisture turning to ice glaze within seconds of exposure. The healer worked quickly, taking a strip here, a strip there, moving around the tree, then moving to another. The harvest was a tax, not a slaughter. The trees would heal. The scars would darken and become part of the texture of the grove. The healer's hands were moving slower now. The dexterity was gone. The fingers were thick, clumsy sausages. The knife slipped once, nicking the glove. The healer paused, staring at the scratch on the leather. No blood. The skin was not broken. A lucky escape. In this cold, a cut would not bleed freely, but it would not heal either. It would remain a raw, open wound for weeks. The healer sheathed the knife with extra care, listening for the click of the retention strap. The bark was gathered into a linen sack, the string tied with teeth in one numb hand. The sack was added to the basket. The load was growing. The list of needs was shrinking, but the day was moving on. The light in the sky had reached its zenith, a pale, diffuse brightness that offered no shadows, only a flat, washing illumination that made depth perception difficult. The world looked two-dimensional, a drawing on a flat sheet of paper. The healer sat on the pack for a moment, resting. The willows provided a slight windbreak. The sound of the wind in the branches was soothing, a chaotic lullaby. The cold was a constant companion, sitting next to the healer, wrapping its arms around the heavy cloak. The healer closed the eyes for a second, just a second. The temptation to sleep was strong. It was a warm, fuzzy feeling in the back of the brain, a dangerous feeling. The eyes snapped open. The healer stood up abruptly, shaking the snow from the cloak. Movement was life. Stasis was death. The pack was swung back onto the shoulders, the weight settling into the familiar grooves of muscle and bone. The healer turned back to the creek. The journey had to continue. There were still the roots of the marsh mallow to find, buried in the frozen mud of the fen. And the fen was miles away, across the open expanse of the frozen beaver pond. The healer stepped back onto the ice. The wind hit the face again. The boots crunched. The breath smoked. The figure moved away from the willows, a solitary speck moving across the blank page of the winter. The silence of the creek swallowed the sound of the footsteps. The willows watched, their yellow branches waving in the gray air, silent witnesses to the slow, heavy passage of duty. The cold deepened as the afternoon began its long, slow slide toward twilight. The air grew sharper, more crystalline. The world was holding its breath. The transition from the sheltered channel of the creek to the open expanse of the beaver pond was a movement from a corridor into a vast, frozen arena. The trees, which had stood as sentinels along the banks, now fell back, receding to the distant perimeter of the wetland. The sky opened up, a massive dome of unyielding gray that pressed down upon the flat, white surface of the ice. The pond was a dead sea, a landscape of suspended animation where the water had been seized by the frost and held captive for months. The surface was not smooth. It was a textured plain of wind-sculpted snow, broken by the jagged stumps of trees that the beavers had felled years ago. These stumps poked through the ice like blackened, rotting teeth, their tops conical and chewed, capped with hats of snow that leaned away from the wind. The wind here had no obstacle. It swept across the open mile of the pond with a predatory efficiency, gathering speed and biting force. It picked up the loose granules of surface snow and drove them horizontally, a low, hissing river of white dust that flowed over the solid ice. This drifting snow obscured the healer's boots, making it appear as though the figure were wading through a shallow, fast-moving current of milk. The temperature on the pond was significantly lower than in the forest. The wind chill stripped the heat from the outer layers of the clothing instantly, seeking the warmth of the skin with relentless determination. The healer tightened the scarf, pulling the wool up to the very bridge of the nose, leaving only a narrow slit for the eyes. The eyelashes were now heavy with ice. Blinking was a slow, deliberate action, the lids sticky and stiff. The walking surface changed. The snow on the pond was hard-packed in places, scoured down to the blue ice in others. The boots skated slightly on the slick patches, the iron hobnails in the heels struggling for purchase. Every step was a calculation of friction and balance. The sound of the crossing was a lonely, rhythmic scratching, the scrape of leather and metal against the hard, resonant surface of the deep freeze. Beneath the boots, the ice was a complex, three-dimensional solid. In the windswept clearings, the healer could look down into the black depth. It was like walking on a pane of obsidian glass. Deep down, faint shapes were visible, the tangled limbs of submerged trees, the undulating fronds of water weeds that waved in the slow, dark current, and the suspended sediment that hung like smoke in the water. The silence of the pond was vast. It was a silence that felt expanded, stretched thin over the miles of ice. The only sounds were the wind's low, hollow moan as it passed over the dead reeds at the edge of the marsh, and the occasional, startling groan of the ice itself. As the temperature fluctuated with the wind, the great sheet of ice expanded and contracted. It would sing, a high, descending trill that sounded like a wire being struck, traveling for miles across the surface. Or it would boom, a deep, resonant thud that felt more like a vibration in the chest than a sound in the ears. The healer did not flinch at these sounds. They were the conversation of the winter, the language of the frozen water. In the center of the pond rose the beaver lodge. It was a chaotic, conical fortress of sticks, mud, and logs, frozen into a solid mass that was as hard as concrete. It looked like a small island of debris rising from the sea of white. The healer altered the course slightly to pass near it. The lodge was a marvel of insulation. The mud, dredged up from the bottom in the autumn, had frozen solid, sealing the sticks together in an impenetrable shell. No wolf, no wolverine could break through that armor. As the healer approached, a faint wisp of vapor could be seen rising from the very peak of the mound. It was barely visible against the gray sky, a ghostly ribbon of steam. It was the breath of the colony inside. Down there beneath the ice in the dry chamber above the water line, the beavers were huddled together, warm in their thick fur, sleeping the winter away in a dark, humid nest. The healer paused for a moment, watching that steam. It was a sign of life in the dead world, a tiny beacon of warmth. The contrast was sharp. The healer, standing in the biting wind, freezing, while beneath the feet, life continued in a warm, dark stupor. The healer did not stop for long. To stop was to envy, and envy burned energy. The legs moved again, the boots sliding on the ice. The far side of the pond dissolved into the fen. This was the destination. The shoreline here was not distinct. It was a gradual transition from solid ice to frozen mud to hummocks of sedge and grass. It was a messy, tangled landscape, now simplified by the snow into a field of white lumps and tall, brown stalks. The marsh mallow grew here in the wettest, deepest mud. Now, of course, the mud was stone. The stalks of the mallow stood tall and brittle, their velvet leaves long gone, their pale pink flowers a memory of August. The stems were gray-brown, rattling against each other in the wind. The healer reached the edge of the fen. The ground here was uneven, treacherous. The hummocks of grass were frozen solid, tripping hazards hidden under the snow. Between them lay pools of ice, some thick, some thin. The healer tested the ground with the handle of the axe, tapping the snow to find the solid earth. The basket was shrugged off, landing with a muffled thud in a snowbank. The relief on the shoulders was immense, blood rushing back into the compressed muscles. The healer rolled the shoulders, grimacing at the stiffness. The excavation began. The marshmallow roots lay deep, buried in the muck that was now a matrix of ice and soil. The healer selected a cluster of large, thick stalks. These would have the most substantial roots. The snow had to be cleared first. The healer used the side of the boot, kicking the snow away, revealing the dark, frozen surface of the swamp. It was black, shiny, and unyielding. The dead stalks were sheared off with the knife, clearing the workspace. Now the axe. It was a small tool, a hatchet really, with a heavy head and a short, stout handle of hickory. The healer removed it from the belt. The wood of the handle was cold, sucking the heat through the mitten. The healer took a stance feet wide apart on the slippery ground. The first blow was a test. The blade struck the frozen mud with a high-pitched clink, bouncing off as if it had hit granite. A few chips of ice and frozen dirt flew up, stinging the face. This was not digging, this was mining. The healer settled into a rhythm. Lift, swing, strike, clink. Lift, swing, strike, clink. The sound echoed across the frozen pond, a lonely industrial noise in the wilderness. The progress was agonizingly slow. The frost line went deep this year. The mud was frozen for at least 6 inches. The healer had to chip away the earth in flakes and shards. The vibration of each impact traveled up the handle, jarring the wrists and elbows. The bones ached with the shock. Breathing became the metronome. Inhale on the lift, exhale on the strike. A grunt of effort escaped with each blow. Ha, clink, ha, clink. The body warmed with the exertion. The blood began to pump harder, chasing the cold away from the core, though the extremities remained numb. Sweat began to form on the forehead, trapped under the wool hat. This was dangerous. Sweat meant moisture. Moisture meant ice. If the healer stopped moving now, the sweat would freeze, chilling the body rapidly. The work had to continue until the task was done. After a long expanse of time, the tone of the impact changed. The high-pitched ring became a dull thud. The axe bit deep, sticking in the earth. The frost layer had been breached. Below the iron-hard crust, the mud was thick and stiff but unfrozen. It was a heavy, dense clay, black and smelling of sulfur and decay. The smell released into the clean, cold air was jarring. The scent of the swamp bottom, of anaerobic rot, of ancient vegetation. It was the smell of the earth's gut. The healer knelt, the knees finding a patch of dry snow. The axe was set aside. Now it was handwork. The outer mittens were removed again, clipped to the belt. The leather-gloved hands reached into the hole. The cold of the mud was different from the cold of the air. It was a wet, sucking cold that grabbed the fingers. The healer clawed at the semi-frozen muck, scooping it out in heavy handfuls. The soil was gritty, abrasive against the leather. The roots were there, pale, twisted shapes hidden in the black slurry. The healer felt for them, tracing their path through the mud. They were thick, rubbery, branching out like the arteries of the earth. Great care was needed now. To cut a root was to damage it, to let the precious mucilage bleed out into the mud. The healer worked the fingers under the root mass, wiggling, pulling gently. The mud made a squelching sound, a wet protest against the intrusion. With a final, steady pull, a large section of root came free. It was heavy, coated in black slime, indistinguishable from a muddy stick to the untrained eye. But the healer knew the weight, the texture. This was the prize, the root of the Althea, the soothing balm for the throat, the healer of the gut. It was ugly, cold, and dirty, but it held the power of summer within its fibers. The healer cleaned the root roughly in the snow, rubbing the black mud away with handfuls of white powder. The snow turned gray and brown, stained by the swamp. The root emerged, a pale yellow-white, scarred and knobby. It was placed in the basket, separated from the delicate berries and the bark by a layer of canvas. The healer looked at the hole. It was a small wound in the frozen earth. There were more roots to get. The process repeated. Stand, axe, clink, Clink, thud, kneel, dig, pull. The repetition was hypnotic, the mind emptied of thought. There was only the angle of the axe, the resistance of the dirt, the sensation of the cold mud. The landscape around the healer remained static, a painted backdrop of gray and white. The wind continued its steady pressure, rustling the dead cattails, whistling over the open ice. Time lost its meaning. The sun, a pale disk behind the clouds, moved imperceptibly across the sky. The physical toll was mounting. The back ached from the bending and swinging. The hands were cramping, the fingers curled into permanent claws from gripping the axe and the roots. The cold was a constant weight, a heavy blanket that could not be shrugged off. But the basket was filling. 3 good roots, 4, 5, it was enough. To take more would be greed. The healer stopped, leaning on the axe handle, breathing heavily. The steam from the body rose up, mingling with the wind. Filling the holes was a necessary courtesy. The healer kicked the frozen clods of earth back into the pits, stomping them down. It would not seal perfectly, but the snow would cover it, and the spring thaw would heal the scar. The landscape had to be left as it was found, or as close to it as possible. The stewardship of the land was as important as the medicine itself. The healer gathered the tools. The axe was wiped clean of mud, the steel dry and cold. It was returned to the belt loop. The mittens were forced back onto the swollen, stiff hands. The basket was hoisted. The weight was significant now. The wet roots added pounds to the load. The straps dug into the shoulders, a familiar, dull pain. The healer adjusted the cloak, shaking off the crust of snow that had formed on the hemline while kneeling. Turning back toward the pond, the healer faced the return journey across the ice. The wind was now a headwind, pushing against the chest, trying to force the figure backward. The walk across the ice would be slower this time. The fatigue was setting in. The body's fuel reserves were burning low. The healer reached into the pouch and pulled out a small handful of dried spruce tips. Chewing on them released a burst of sharp, citrus-like flavor, a small stimulant to wake the senses. The crossing of the pond was a study in perseverance. The figure leaned forward at a 45-degree angle, battling the air. The boots slipped and gripped. The ice boomed again, a loud crack that seemed to originate right beneath the feet. The healer did not pause. The ice was 3 feet thick. It would hold a regiment of soldiers, let alone one weary gatherer. The sound was just the ice adjusting to the dropping temperature of the afternoon. As the healer reached the midpoint of the pond near the beaver lodge, the light began to change. The flat gray of the sky was deepening, taking on a violet hue at the edges. The afternoon was waning. The shadows of the snagged trees on the ice, previously non-existent in the diffuse light, began to stretch out, faint, long pale blue lines pointing toward the east. The texture of the snow became more pronounced, the ridges and drifts casting their own micro-shadows. The world was gaining contrast again. The healer passed the lodge, glancing once more at the steam vent. It was still puffing, a rhythmic respiration. The thought of the warmth inside was almost painful. To be curled up in the dark, smelling of wet fur and wood shavings, safe from the wind, the healer pushed the thought away. There was no warmth here. There was only the walk. The wind was the reality. The cold was the truth. Reaching the far bank, the shelter of the trees was a welcome relief. The wind died down instantly as the healer stepped into the timber. The roar became a murmur. The air was still, though no less cold. It felt startlingly quiet after the exposure of the open pond. The ringing in the ears from the wind ceased, replaced by the profound, heavy silence of the deep woods. The trees stood tall and dark, welcoming the traveler back into their shadows. The path now led upward again, away from the wetland and toward the rocky outcrops of the limestone bluffs. This was a different terrain. The The ground was hard, rocky, and uneven. The trees were sparse, cedars and junipers that twisted out of the stone, their roots clinging to cracks in the rock. The healer needed the blue juniper berries. They were the diuretic, the cleanser. They grew high where the drainage was good and the sun struck the rocks. The climb was slow. The legs were tired, the lactic acid building in the thighs. The boots scuffed on the limestone, the sound harsh and scratching. The snow here was thinner, blown away by the wind, revealing the gray skeleton of the earth. The rocks were covered in lichens, circular patches of pale green and orange that looked like ancient coins frozen to the stone. The healer stepped carefully. A twisted ankle here would be a disaster. The junipers appeared as dark, shaggy shapes against the gray stone. They were old trees, gnarled and twisted by centuries of wind. Their bark was shredding, hanging in long, fibrous strips. The foliage was a dusty blue-green, sharp and prickly. And there, nestled among the needles, were the berries. They were small, round, and a deep, dusty blue, covered in a waxy bloom that looked like frost. The healer approached a low-hanging branch. The scent of the juniper was strong here, a sharp, gin-like smell that cleared the sinuses. It was a clean, antiseptic smell. The gathering here was different. The berries were small and had to be picked one by one or gently shaken into the hand. The gloves were too clumsy. The healer had to expose the fingertips again. The process was a torture of small movements. The skin of the fingers, already sensitized by the cold mud of the fen, screamed at the touch of the frozen air. The berries were like little bullets of ice. The healer picked quickly, plucking the blue pearls from the prickly embrace of the needles. Pluck, drop, pluck, drop. The berries made a light, rattling sound as they hit the bottom of a small canvas sack. The wind on the bluff was not as strong as on the pond, but it was sharper, cutting around the corners of the rocks with a whistling sound. The view from here was expansive. The healer could see back across the beaver pond, a white sheet in the distance, and beyond that the dark line of the pine forest where the journey had begun hours ago. The cabin was miles away, a tiny speck in the imagination, invisible in reality. The sun was lower now, a heavy-lidded eye sinking toward the horizon. The cold was changing. It was no longer an assault, it was a settling. The temperature was dropping as the day died. The air was becoming brittle, hard. The moisture was freezing out of it, leaving it crystal clear and magnifying the distance. The healer could see individual trees on the far ridge, miles away. The clarity was hallucination sharp. The bag of juniper berries was tied shut. It was light, a small harvest, but potent. The healer returned the gloves to the hands, blowing hot air into them first. The warmth was fleeting, gone in seconds. The hands were tools that were slowly breaking down. They needed fire. They needed rest. But not yet. The healer turned away from the view, facing the forest again. The next leg of the journey led into the dark heart of the old growth, the place of the giant hemlocks and the deep, permanent shadows. There, the usnea moss grew, the old man's beard, the antibiotic of the woods. It hung high in the branches, accessible only where the wind had brought a limb down. It was a scavenger hunt in the gloom. The healer adjusted the pack. The weight was a part of the body now. The rhythm of the walk reasserted itself. Step, crunch, step, crunch. The figure moved into the trees, disappearing into the shadows as the light began to fail. The gray of the day was surrendering to the blue of the evening. The cold deepened. The silence held. The boundary of the old growth was not marked by a fence or a clearing, but by a sudden and profound shift in scale. As the healer descended from the rocky spine of the limestone bluffs, the trees, which had been merely large before, now became monumental. These were the ancient ones, the survivors of fires and storms that had raged before the memory of any living man. They were hemlocks and white pines of immense girth, their trunks rising like pillars of dark iron into a canopy so high and so dense that it blotted out the remaining light of the sky. Entering this part of the forest was like walking into the nave of a ruined cathedral, a place of heavy, suffocating silence where the air itself seemed compressed by the weight of the wood. The light here was already failing, trapped in the perpetual twilight of the understory. The gray of the afternoon was replaced by a deep, aqueous blue, a submarine gloom that softened the edges of the world. The snow on the forest floor was not the smooth, wind-swept blanket of the open pond. Here, it was a landscape of deep, soft pillows, mounded over the wreckage of centuries. Fallen giants, trees that had come down in the storms of the previous decade, lay crisscrossed in the gloom, their rotting hulks covered in thick capes of moss and snow. They formed a labyrinth of timber that the healer had to navigate with slow, deliberate care. The wind was gone. The dense wall of the outer forest stripped the gale of its power, leaving the air in the center perfectly still. This stillness was unsettling. It was a vacuum of sound, a void that pressed against the eardrums. The healer's breathing sounded ragged and loud, a rasping intrusion on the quiet. The crunch of the boots was muffled by the depth of the snow, which was soft and powdery here, protected from the sun and the wind. The healer sank to the mid-calf with every step, the snow falling back into the footprints like dry sand. It was exhausting work, a slow motion wading through a white tide. The healer stopped, leaning back to look up. The movement caused a sharp pain in the cold, stiffened neck, a crick that radiated down the spine. The head tilted back, the eyes searching the canopy. Far above, hundreds of feet in the air, the tops of the trees swayed gently, a silent dance against the darkening sky. But down here, nothing moved. The search was for the usnea, the old man's beard. It grew high in the humid upper branches, clinging to the bark of the dying limbs. It was out of reach, a treasure hung in the rafters. The healer could not climb these monsters. The bark was slick with ice, the branches too high. The harvest relied on the wind. The healer scanned the forest floor, looking for the telltale shape of a freshly fallen branch. The snow hid many things, smoothing out the jagged lines of broken wood. The eyes had to be sharp, looking for the texture of the lichen against the white snow. The usnea was a pale, gray-green color, a tangled mass of fibers that looked like matted hair or spiderwebs. In the blue light, it was almost invisible, blending into the shadows. The healer moved forward, weaving between the trunks. The bark of these trees was deeply fissured, plates of armor that were inches thick. The healer ran a gloved hand along a trunk as they passed, feeling the roughness, the cold, dry texture of the ancient wood. It felt like stone. These trees were living geology, slow and enduring. The sense of time in this place was crushing. The healer was a fleeting spark, a momentary warmth in a landscape of slow, cold eternity. There, ahead, lying across a hummock of snow, was a large limb. It had come down recently, perhaps in the storm of the previous night. The wood was shattered at the break, the splinters sharp and pale yellow against the dark bark. It was a hemlock branch, heavy and laden with cones, and draped over it like tattered shrouds were the festoons of the moss. The healer approached the fallen limb. It was a tangled mess of needles and twigs. The snow around it was disturbed, the impact having shaken the powder from the nearby bushes. The healer knelt, the heavy wool of the trousers soaking up the cold from the snow immediately. The knees were sore, bruised from the day's labor. The joint protested the bend, a dull ache that was familiar and constant. The usnea was beautiful in a desolate way. It hung in long, intricate strands, a complex network of branching fibers that were dry and brittle to the touch. The healer reached out, the fingers brushing the moss. It felt rough, like dry wool. This was the antibiotic, the lung healer. It soaked up the moisture and the nutrients from the air, concentrating the essence of the forest in its fibers. The harvesting began. The healer pulled the clumps of moss from the branch. It came away easily, tearing with a soft ripping sound. The dust of the lichen floated in the air, a fine, acrid powder that tickled the nose. The healer worked systematically, starting at one end of the branch and moving to the other. The moss was stuffed into a large, lightweight sack made of cotton. It was bulky but weighed almost nothing. The sack filled quickly, becoming a soft, pillow-like shape. As the healer worked, the light continued to drain away. The blue deepened to indigo. The shadows stretched and merged, swallowing the details of the forest floor. The trees became silhouettes, black cutouts against a dark gray background. The visibility dropped to a few yards. It was becoming difficult to distinguish the moss from the pine needles. The healer squinted, bringing the branch closer to the face. The cold was deepening, settling into the hollow of the back, creeping under the collar. The harvest from this branch was good, but not enough. The healer stood, the knees cracking loudly in the silence. The sack was tied to the outside of the basket, too bulky to fit inside. It hung there, a white bulbous shape against the dark wicker. The healer looked around. The forest was now a place of shapes and suggestions. To find more, light was needed. The healer reached for the lantern at the belt. It was a heavy, brass construction, battered and tarnished. The glass was thick, bubbled in places. The cold metal stung the fingers through the gloves. The process of lighting it was a ritual of survival. The healer turned their back to the slight draft, shielding the mechanism with the body. The small door of the lantern was opened with a squeak of frozen hinges. The match was struck. The flare of the sulfur was blinding in the gloom. A sudden explosion of white light that contracted the pupils instantly. The flame touched the wick. It caught, a blue curve turning to yellow. The healer closed the door. The light steadied, glowing warm and golden. It pushed the darkness back, creating a sphere of influence perhaps 10 feet across. Inside this sphere, the world was rendered in warm tones, the brown of the tree trunks, the green of the needles, the white of the snow. Outside the sphere, the darkness seemed to thicken, pressing in against the light. The shadows of the tree trunks radiated outward like the spokes of a wheel, moving as the healer moved. The healer walked on, carrying the star. The lantern swung with the rhythm of the steps, the light washing over the snow, revealing the tracks of mice, the debris of the forest, the hidden roots. The search continued. The pool of light moved through the vast, dark nave of the forest, a lonely beacon. The healer found another branch, smaller this time, half buried in a drift. The light revealed the pale green beard of the moss. The healer stopped, knelt, and gathered. The isolation was absolute. The healer was the only living thing in the world, or so it felt. The silence was so deep it was almost a noise, a high-pitched frequency at the edge of hearing. The cold was a physical pressure, a weight that sat on the shoulders and pressed down on the head. The breath smoked in the lantern light, swirling in turbid clouds that obscured the vision for seconds at a time. The basket was now full. The list was complete. The wintergreen, the berries, the bark, the roots, the moss. The weight was significant, a burden that pulled at the muscles of the back and shoulders. The straps of the basket were cutting off the circulation to the arms, making the hands tingle with pins and needles. The healer adjusted the load, shrugging the shoulders, but there was no real relief. The only relief would be the cabin. The cabin. The thought of it was a sharp pang of longing. The fire, the chair, the absence of wind. But the cabin was miles away, back through the old growth, across the frozen creek, through the pine forest. The journey home was always longer than the journey out. The body was tired, the fuel low. The cold had had hours to work its way into the core. The healer checked the internal compass. The direction was known, felt in the bones. Northwest, back towards the rising slope of the valley. The healer turned, the lantern swinging, the shadows wheeling around. The return began. The pace was slower now. The spring was gone from the step. It was a trudge, a placing of one foot in front of the other. The temperature dropped precipitously as night fully took hold. The air became brittle, sharp as glass. The moisture in the nose froze instantly, the nostrils sticking together with every breath. The scarf was a mask of ice, a hard shell that had to be broken occasionally to allow air to pass. The healer could feel the cold radiating from the trees, from the snow, from the sky. It was a world of ice. The walk through the old growth at night was a different experience. The trees were no longer majestic, they were oppressive. The darkness between them was solid. The lantern light caught only glimpses, a patch of bark, a hanging branch, a sudden drop in the ground. The healer had to be vigilant. Roots snake across the path, hidden under the snow, waiting to catch a tired foot. The healer stumbled once, pitching forward, caught only by a quick step and a grab at a sapling. The heart hammered against the ribs, a sudden drumbeat of adrenaline. A fall here with this heavy load could mean injury, and injury here meant death. The healer steadied the breathing, slowed down, precision over speed. The path wound its way through the labyrinth. The healer recognized a tree, a massive hemlock with a scar on its trunk that looked like a lightning bolt, a landmark. The path was true. The confidence returned, a small warmth in the chest. The sound of the forest at night was different. The silence was still dominant, but there were small, sharp sounds now. The popping of a tree freezing, the soft whump of snow falling from a branch, the scuttle of a nocturnal creature in the undergrowth, unseen but heard. The healer was an intruder in the night world, a noisy, clumsy giant carrying a false sun. The exit from the old growth was gradual. The trees began to thin, the spacing between them widening. The oppressive canopy opened up, revealing the sky. It was black now, a deep, velvety black scattered with stars. The stars were hard and bright, diamonds of cold fire. They offered no light, only a reminder of the vastness of the universe and the smallness of the healer. The Milky Way was a smudge of white powder across the zenith, a frozen river in the sky. The healer stepped out of the deep woods and back onto the rocky ground near the bluffs. The wind returned. It was lighter than before, a cold breeze that drained down the slopes, carrying the chill of the high ground into the valley. It caught the lantern, making the flame flicker and dance. The shadows jumped wildly. The healer shielded the light with the cloak, protecting the precious flame. The descent from the bluffs was treacherous in the dark. The rocks were slick with frost. The snow was thin and treacherous. The healer moved sideways, using the edges of the boots to cut into the slope. The lantern was held low, illuminating the placement of the feet. Every step was a decision. This rock? No, too smooth. That patch of snow? Yes, it looks packed. The weight of the basket shifted with the angle of the descent, pulling the healer off balance. The core muscles tightened to compensate. The thighs burned. The knees shook with the effort of breaking the descent. It was a controlled fall, a slow slide down the face of the hill. At the bottom of the slope, the terrain leveled out again. The healer paused to catch the breath. The cloud of vapor was thick and white in the lantern light, hanging in the air for a long time before dissipating. The cold was profound. The fingers holding the lantern handle were locked in a grip that would be difficult to open. The toes were numb. The nose was a block of wood. The healer looked back at the bluffs. They were a black wall against the stars. The old growth was a pool of ink. The journey had been successful, but the cost was paid in energy and warmth. Now the long march across the valley floor remained. The creek, the pine forest, the clearing. The healer adjusted the cloak, pulling it tighter around the throat. The wool was stiff with cold, freezing into rigid folds. The fur of the hood was frosted white with breath. The healer turned to the northwest. The lantern swung forward. The circle of light moved across the snow. The crunch of the boots resumed. Crunch, crunch, crunch. A steady, slow rhythm that measured out the miles. The mind began to retreat again, seeking the trance state. It focused on the image of the ember in the hearth, the red eye of the fire. It was the destination. It was the promise. The healer visualized the key in the lock, the door opening, the smell of the smoke. This visualization was the fuel that kept the legs moving. The landscape was open here, a meadow of snow and scrub brush. The wind had sculpted the drifts into waves, a frozen ocean. The lantern light cast long, shifting shadows from the bushes, creating the illusion of movement. Shapes seemed to dart at the edge of the vision. The healer ignored them. They were phantoms of fatigue. There was nothing out here but the cold and the dark. The path led towards the creek again, but at a different point, higher upstream. The sound of the water was faint, a whisper under the ice. The healer walked, the head bowed, the eyes fixed on the small circle of yellow light that led the way. The world was reduced to this, a pair of boots, a circle of snow, and the rhythm of the march. The cold was not an enemy anymore, it was the environment. It was the medium through which the healer moved. To fight it was to lose. One had to accept it, to become dense and slow like the winter itself. The stars watched, the wind breathed, the healer walked. The night was young and the path was long. The darkness was a heavy fluid that filled the valley, and the lantern was a tiny bubble of air rising slowly towards the surface. The endurance continued. The circle of light cast by the lantern was a solitary island of existence floating in a boundless ocean of night. Within this sphere, which extended perhaps 3 strides in any direction, the world retained its color and its texture. The snow was a glittering, crystalline white, sparkled with sudden flashes of diamond, where the candlelight caught a sharp edge of ice. The leather of the boots was a rich, dark brown, creased and worn. The hem of the green wool cloak was distinct, dragging heavy and stiff over the drifts. But beyond this fragile boundary of yellow illumination, the universe dissolved into an absolute, crushing void. The darkness was not merely an absence of light. It was a physical substance, a wall of heavy indigo velvet that pressed in against the lantern's glow, constantly testing the strength of the flame. It was a darkness that swallowed sound and distance, rendering the rest of the forest a theoretical concept, remembered but not seen. The healer moved within this moving bubble, a prisoner of the immediate. The visual field was restricted to the placement of the next step, the texture of the snow immediately ahead, and the rhythmic swing of the lantern's brass cage. Creak, swing, crunch, step. The pattern was mesmerizing, a loop of sensory input that had been repeating for hours. The mind, deprived of the horizon and the sky, turned inward, spiraling down into a meditative state where the only realities were the weight of the basket and the sensation of the cold. The cold had evolved. It was no longer a sharp, biting intruder that attacked the skin. It had settled into a deep, permeating heavy weight, a saturation of the muscles and bones. The healer felt heavy, dense, as if the body were slowly turning into stone or hardwood. The blood seemed to move sluggishly in the veins, a thick, cooling syrup that struggled to reach the fingertips and the toes. The path, such as it was, led down the gentle slope of the meadow toward the upper crossing of the creek. The sound of the water began to intrude on the silence, a low, muffled gurgling that came from beneath the ice. Unlike the downstream crossing, where the water flowed deep and slow, here the creek was shallow and rocky. The ice was not a smooth sheet but a chaotic sculpture of frozen turbulence. The water had frozen as it rushed over stones, creating humps and jagged ridges of white ice that looked like arrested waves. The lantern light caught these formations, casting long, confusing shadows that danced and twisted as the healer moved. Reaching the bank, the healer paused. The descent to the ice was short but steep, a 3-foot drop over a lip of frozen mud and exposed roots. In the daylight, it was a trivial obstacle. In the dark, with a heavy load and numb limbs, it was a puzzle of mechanics. The healer lowered the center of gravity, crouching slightly. The knees popped, a sound like dry branches breaking. One hand, the one not holding the lantern, reached out to grasp the trunk of a sapling alder. The bark was cold and slick. The healer tested the grip, the leather glove slipping slightly before biting in. With a slow, controlled slide, the boot skidded down the bank, landing on the marginal ice with a solid thud. The ice here was thick, built up by layers of splash and spray that had frozen over weeks. It was rough, textured like coarse sandpaper. The healer stepped out onto the creek bed. The sound of the boots changed from the soft crunch of snow to the hard, ringing scrape of metal hobnails on ice. Scrape, clink, scrape. The lantern was held low, the light skimming across the surface. It revealed a landscape of mesmerizing complexity. Below the translucent upper layer of ice, the water was black and moving. White bubbles of air, trapped in the flow, zipped past like shooting stars in a dark sky. Veins of white tension fractures ran through the black ice, looking like lightning bolts frozen in time. The crossing was slow. The surface was uneven. The healer had to step over boulders that were capped with domes of ice, smooth and treacherous as glass. The boots sought the depressions, the rough patches between the stones. The balance was constantly challenged. The basket on the back, heavy with the day's harvest of wet roots and dense wood, acted as a pendulum, trying to swing the body off-center. The healer compensated with small, jerky movements of the hips and shoulders, a constant, exhausted dance of equilibrium. The wind channeled down the creek bed, colder here than in the meadow, carrying the damp chill of the open water that lay somewhere miles downstream. It pulled at the cloak, snapping the heavy wool fabric like a flag. In the middle of the creek, the healer stopped. The lantern was raised. The light fell upon a large, flat rock that rose above the ice, free of snow. It was a resting place. The healer sat on the stone, the cold of the rock seeping through the wool trousers instantly, but the relief of taking the weight off the feet was worth the thermal cost. The basket was rested on the rock behind, the straps loosened but not removed. To remove them would require too much effort to put back on. The healer sat hunched, elbows on knees, staring at the lantern flame. The flame was a small, frantic thing. It jumped and shivered inside the glass chimney, buffeted by the drafts that leaked through the vents. It was the only source of warmth in the universe. The healer brought the gloved hands close to the glass, cupping them around the chimney. The heat was faint, a whisper of thermal energy that barely penetrated the leather. But it was there. The healer closed the eyes, imagining the heat traveling into the palms, up the wrists, into the blood. It was a visualization exercise, a trick of the mind to keep the despair at bay. The silence of the creek was profound, layered over the sound of the wind. It was the silence of a stopped clock, of a held breath. After a measured count of 100 breaths, the healer stood. The joints had stiffened in the short pause. The first movement was agony, a grinding of cold surfaces. The healer groaned, a low sound that was lost instantly in the wind. The march resumed. The far bank was a wall of snow and dark brush. The ascent was a clawing struggle. The boots kicked steps into the frozen bank. The free hand grabbed at roots, pulling the heavy body up. The basket caught on a branch, jerking the healer back. A moment of panic, a flailing of arms, a slip of the foot. Then stability. The healer leaned into the slope, powering up with the thighs, cresting the bank and rolling onto the flat ground at the top. The landscape on this side of the creek was different. This was the burn. Decades ago, a lightning strike had ignited this section of the forest. The fire had burned hot and fast, consuming the needles and the underbrush, killing the trees but leaving their trunks standing. Now it was a ghost forest. The trees were blackened spires, stripped of bark and branches, standing like charred pillars against the night sky. There was no canopy here to block the wind or the snow. The ground was covered in a deep, uniform blanket of white, unbroken by the shelter of boughs. The visual contrast in the lantern light was stark. The snow was blindingly white, the trees absolute black. There were no mid-tones, no soft grays or browns. It was a world of ink and chalk. The light threw long, hard shadows from the standing trunks, shadows that stretched out like the bars of a prison cell across the snow. As the healer moved, the shadows rotated, opening and closing like scissor blades. The effect was disorienting, a strobing of dark and light that messed with the equilibrium. The healer focused on the ground, watching the boots break the pristine crust. The wind in the burn was different. It did not roar through branches, it hissed around the smooth, dead trunks. It whistled through the cracks in the charcoal wood. It was a thin, reedy sound, lonely and desolate. The snow here was wind-packed, hard enough to support the weight sometimes, breaking through at others. The rhythm of the walk became irregular. Step, hold, step, crash. The sudden drops were jarring, sending shocks up the spine. The basket thumped against the back with every drop. The cold seemed more intense here, exposed as the healer was to the open sky. The stars overhead were bright and hard, indifferent eyes watching the slow progress. The Milky Way was a smudge of diamond dust. The healer did not look up. The neck was too stiff to crane backward. The gaze was fixed on the pool of yellow light, the only reality that mattered. The breath froze in the scarf, creating a solid block of ice that chafed the chin. The moisture from the eyes froze on the lashes, gluing them together at the corners. The healer had to blink forcefully, tears of cold running down the cheeks and freezing on the skin. Navigating the burn required memory and instinct. There were no landmarks, no distinct trees to guide the way. It was a field of identical black poles. The healer relied on the internal compass, the sense of direction honed by years of walking these woods. Northwest, keep the wind on the left cheek, keep the slope rising gently to the right. The mind drifted, detaching from the body. The healer watched the boots moving as if they belonged to someone else. Left, right, left, right. The legs were pistons, mechanical and tireless, driven by a simple command: go home. The passage through the burn seemed to take an eternity. Time distended, stretching out like the shadows. Had it been an hour, 10 minutes, a day, there was no way to tell. The darkness was timeless. The lantern sputtered, the flame dipping low for a second before flaring back up. The oil was getting low, not empty but low. The healer noted this with a detached calm. If the light died, the journey would become infinitely harder, perhaps impossible. But there was nothing to be done. The oil was in the reservoir. It would last or it would not. To worry was to waste energy. Gradually, the landscape began to change. The charred trunks became fewer. Living trees began to appear, small stunted spruce at first, then larger pines. The transition was slow, a fading in of life. The shadows softened. The stark black and white gave way to the textured grays and browns of the living forest. The wind changed its voice, picking up the roar of the needles again. The healer felt a flicker of relief. The living forest offered shelter. It offered sound. It offered the illusion of company. Entering the tree line again was like stepping indoors. The wind dropped. The air became still and heavy. The smell of the burn, wet charcoal, and old ash was replaced by the clean, sharp scent of pine and frozen sap. The snow softened, becoming deep and powdery again. The crunch returned. The silence returned. The healer moved into the shadows, the lantern light now washing over rough bark and green needles. The path now followed an old game trail, a narrow corridor through the dense growth. The branches encroached on the path, heavy with snow. The healer had to brush them aside, the movement slow and sweeping. Showers of snow fell from the disturbed boughs, landing on the hood and shoulders, adding their cold weight to the burden. The snow melted on the neck, trickling down the spine in icy rivulets. The healer shivered, a violent convulsion that shook the whole frame. It was a warning sign. The core temperature was dropping. The furnace was running low on fuel. The healer reached into a pocket, fumbling with numb fingers for the last piece of dried meat. It was hard as wood, frozen solid. The healer put it in the mouth, not chewing, just holding it there, letting the saliva thaw it slowly. The taste was salt and smoke, a weak signal to the stomach. The jaw muscles were too stiff to chew effectively. The act of eating was a chore, a mechanical necessity. The trail began to wind around the base of a large hill. The ground was uneven, filled with roots and hidden stones. The lantern light revealed the tracks of a wolf, fresh in the snow. Large prints, deep and purposeful, heading in the same direction. The healer stopped, crouching to examine them. The edges were sharp. The snow had not yet drifted into the depressions. The wolf had passed here recently, perhaps within the hour. The healer felt no fear, only a kinship. The wolf was walking the winter night too. They were both travelers in the dark, seeking warmth, seeking survival. The healer stood, the knees protesting loudly. The walk continued. The presence of the wolf tracks added a new layer to the sensory experience. The healer listened more intently, straining to hear the soft pad of paws or the snap of a twig. But there was nothing. Only the wind in the upper branches and the creak of the trees. The forest was vast and empty. The wolf was a ghost, a presence felt but not seen. The terrain began to rise. The path was leading up toward the saddle of the ridge that separated this valley from the next. The climb was gentle but relentless. The gravity was a hand pulling backward on the basket. The straps cut into the shoulders, bruising the muscle. The healer leaned forward, counterbalancing the weight. The breath came in short, sharp gasps, the steam billowing around the lantern. Huff, puff, huff, puff. The rhythm of the breath synced with the rhythm of the steps. The trees on the slope were large white pines, their trunks straight and tall. They formed a colonnade, a dark hallway leading upward. The lantern light flickered off the resin blisters on the bark, turning them into glittering jewels. The beauty of the forest was cold and indifferent. It did not care if the healer made it to the cabin or froze on the trail. It simply existed, perfect and cruel. The healer's mind began to play tricks. The patterns of the bark seemed to form faces, twisted and grotesque, watching from the shadows. The swaying branches looked like arms reaching out to grab the cloak. The sound of the wind sounded like voices, whispering unintelligible words. Sleep, they seemed to say. Rest, just for a moment. The healer shook the head, a physical rejection of the auditory hallucinations. It was the cold talking. It was the exhaustion whispering. Focus on the light. Focus on the snow. Focus on the boots. The mantra repeated. The healer narrowed the world down to the illuminated circle. Inside the circle there was control. Outside there was chaos. The boots moved. 1, 2, 1, 2. The snow crunched. The lantern creaked. The hill rose. The crest of the saddle was a wind tunnel. As the healer emerged from the shelter of the slope, the wind hit with renewed force. It drove ice crystals into the exposed skin around the eyes. The lantern swung wildly, the shadows spinning. The healer lowered the head, tucking the chin into the chest, driving forward against the gale. The descent on the other side would be easier, gravity assisting. But for now, it was a battle against the air itself. The view from the top of the saddle was non-existent in the dark. In the day, one could see the next valley, the distant smoke of the cabin. Now there was only a wall of black. The lantern illuminated nothing but the swirling snow that was being driven over the ridge. It was like walking into a cloud of white bees. The healer pushed through, the cloak flapping loudly, a sound like a sail in a storm. Crossing the ridge took minutes that felt like hours. The wind was relentless, stripping the heat away, finding every gap in the clothing. The healer felt the numbness creeping up the arms, past the elbows. The feet were blocks of ice, the toes no longer sending signals to the brain. The only sensation in the feet was the dull impact of the boot against the ground. Finally, the ground began to slope downward. The healer had crossed the divide. The wind eased as the figure descended below the crest. The roar faded. The swirling snow settled. The healer stepped back into the quiet of the leeward side. The relief was physical, a loosening of the tension in the shoulders. The path down was steep, winding through a grove of young cedar. The air was still and smelled of evergreen. The healer paused to adjust the lantern. The flame was definitely lower now. The oil was nearly gone. The light was dimmer, the sphere of influence shrinking. The shadows were pressing in closer. The healer tapped the metal reservoir, a hollow sound, not much left. Maybe an hour, maybe less. The cabin was still miles away. The urgency, usually suppressed, flared briefly in the chest. A cold knot of anxiety. No, panic is death, pace is life. The healer took a deep breath, holding the freezing air in the lungs, then exhaled slowly. The cloud of breath floated away into the dark. The walk resumed. The pace increased slightly, aided by the downhill gradient. The boots moved faster. Crunch, 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 crunch. The lantern swung with a slightly more desperate rhythm. The darkness waited at the edge of the light, patient and eternal. The healer walked into it, a small spark carrying a heavy load, moving deeper into the night. The journey was far from over. The deepest cold was yet to come. The descent through the cedar grove was a journey into a narrowing tunnel of perception. As the healer moved downward, the surrounding trees grew closer together. Their branches interlaced into a dense, woven ceiling that blocked the sky. The darkness here was palpable, a heavy, suffocating substance that seemed to push against the fragile glass of the lantern. The flame, now feeding on the very dregs of the oil, was no longer a steady yellow beacon. It had become a pulsating, orange heartbeat, rhythmic and weak. With every step the healer took, the light wavered, shrinking the visible world to a radius of mere feet, then expanding slightly, then shrinking again. It was a hypnotic, dying strobe that played tricks on the tired mind, making the twisted roots of the cedars appear to writhe and crawl across the snow. The silence in the grove was absolute. The wind, which had hammered against the ridge above, was entirely absent here. There was no rustle of branches, no creak of timber. The only sound was the healer's own passage, the crunch of the boots, the heavy, labored breathing, and the faint, wet sputtering of the wick. The air was heavy with the scent of cedar oil and frozen earth, a smell that was both sharp and musty, like the inside of an old chest. The cold was a static presence, a standing pool of freezing air that had settled in this hollow and remained undisturbed for weeks. It bit through the layers of wool with a renewed intensity, finding the sweat that had dried on the skin during the climb and turning it into a layer of rime. Then it happened. There was no drama to the moment, only a simple physical cessation. The lantern sputtered once, a wet hiss, and the orange flame detached itself from the wick, floating for a millisecond as a ghost of light before vanishing completely. The darkness did not fall, it rushed in. It collapsed upon the healer instantly, a physical weight that pressed against the eyes. For a moment there was nothing. The world was erased. The healer stopped, standing perfectly still in the void. The sudden blindness was disorienting, inducing a moment of vertigo where up and down seemed to lose their meaning. The basket felt heavier, pulling the body backward into the invisible snow. The healer did not panic. Panic was a waste of heat. Instead, the healer waited. The eyes, strained by the hours of staring at the artificial light, needed time to reset. The rod cells in the retina began to awaken, sensing the faint, ambient photons that filtered through the forest canopy. Slowly, painfully slowly, the world began to reconstruct itself. It was not the world of color and depth that had existed minutes ago. It was a world of gray shadows and black voids. The snow was no longer white. It was a pale, luminescent gray, glowing with the reflected light of the stars that pierced the canopy gaps. The trees were columns of solid shadow, blacker than the night around them. The healer reached down and unhooked the lantern. It was useless weight now, cold metal and glass. It was placed gently at the base of a large cedar, nestled between the roots. It would be retrieved in the spring or perhaps never. It was a marker of the journey, left behind like a shed skin. The hands, freed from the burden of the handle, were tucked into the opposite sleeves of the cloak, creating a muff to preserve warmth. The walk resumed. Without the lantern, the pace slowed significantly. The feet had to become the eyes. The boots slid forward tentatively, testing the ground for roots, for holes, for ice. The sensory focus shifted from vision to touch and hearing. The texture of the snow under the sole communicated the terrain. Soft meant deep drift, hard meant wind-packed, slick meant ice. The sound of the boot breaking the crust told the healer the density of the snowpack. Crump, slide, crump, slide. The rhythm was broken, hesitant. The path continued downward, leaving the cedars and entering a ravine of jagged limestone. This was the throat of the valley, a narrow gorge cut by the ancient river. The walls of the gorge rose up on either side, vertical cliffs of gray stone that blotted out the stars. The darkness here was deep, a pool of ink. The air was damp, carrying the metallic taste of raw stone and subterranean ice. The healer moved along the bottom of the gorge, following the frozen bed of the seasonal stream. Here the cold took on a new dimension. It was the cold of the grave, deep and still. The rocks radiated a chill that seemed to suck the heat directly from the bones. The healer could feel the marrow freezing. The toes were long gone, numb appendages that struck the ground with dull thuds. The fingers were stiff claws inside the sleeves. The nose and cheeks were masks of frozen flesh, devoid of sensation. The only warmth remaining was deep in the core, a small, guarded ember in the chest. The gorge was filled with ice formations. Water, seeping from the cracks in the cliff walls, had frozen into massive curtains of icicles that hung like stalactites in a cavern. In the faint gray light, they looked like the pipes of a great organ, pale and ghostly. The healer passed close to them, feeling the cold radiating from the ice. Some of the formations had collapsed, littering the path with shattered blocks of ice that looked like broken glass in the gloom. The boots crunched over the debris, the sound echoing sharply off the stone walls. Clack, clatter, echo. The mind began to drift further, detaching from the suffering of the body. The healer found themselves thinking of the summer, the smell of hot pine needles, the buzz of bees in the fireweed, the warmth of the sun on the back of the neck. It was a dangerous reverie. The body, confused by the extreme cold, began to send false signals. A sudden flush of heat washed over the skin. The desire to stop, to take off the heavy cloak, to lie down in the cool snow was overwhelming. It was the paradox of hypothermia, the siren song of the freeze. The healer recognized it with a distant, clinical detachment. Do not stop. Do not strip. Keep moving. The command was repeated like a mantra. The gorge opened out into a wider amphitheater of stone. In the center lay the frozen falls. In summer, this was a roaring cascade of white water. Now it was a silent monument to stasis. The water had been caught in mid-fall, frozen into a massive, undulating sculpture of blue-gray ice. It billowed out at the bottom, forming a chaotic apron of frozen spray. The silence here was profound. The roar of the water was locked inside the ice, a potential energy waiting for the spring. The healer stopped to look at it. The sheer scale of the frozen motion was humbling. It was a snapshot of power held in suspension. To bypass the falls, the healer had to climb the scree slope to the side. The rocks were loose, covered in a thin glaze of verglas. It was a treacherous ascent in the dark. The healer moved on all fours, hands grappling with the cold stones, boots scrabbling for purchase. The basket swung dangerously, unbalancing the figure. The breath came in ragged gasps, the throat burning with the intake of the freezing air. The sound of the struggle, the scraping of boots, the clatter of dislodged stones was loud in the quiet amphitheater. Halfway up the slope, the healer slipped. A rock rolled under the left boot. The leg shot out, the body pitching forward. The chest hit the stones with a heavy thud. The air was driven from the lungs. The healer lay there for a moment, cheek pressed against the icy rock, gasping for breath. The pain was distant, dulled by the cold. The temptation to stay there was strong. The rock felt solid, supportive. To close the eyes, to let the darkness take over. Move, the will kicked in, a spark in the dark. The healer pushed up, the arms shaking. The ascent continued, hand over hand, foot over foot. Reaching the top of the falls, the ground leveled out. The healer stood, brushing the snow and rock dust from the front of the cloak. The view from the top was of the next valley, a long, dark trough filled with the gray sea of the forest. The cabin was down there somewhere. The path now followed the rim of the gorge. The wind returned here, blowing across the open rock. It was a flanking wind, pushing the healer toward the edge. The figure leaned into it, compensating. The walk was a mechanical trudge. The legs were heavy logs swinging from the hips. The hip joints ached with a dull, grinding pain. The lower back was a knot of tension. The moon began to rise. It was a gibbous moon, a heavy, lopsided coin of pale yellow rising above the eastern ridge. Its light changed the world again. The gray darkness was replaced by a stark, high-contrast landscape of silver and black. The shadows of the trees stretched out across the snow, incredibly long and sharp. The snow crystals caught the moonlight, sparking with a cold, glittering fire. The world looked beautiful and deadly, a landscape of silver nitrate. The moonlight revealed the texture of the forest floor in exquisite detail. The undulations of the drifts, the patterns of the wind-scoured snow, the intricate lacework of the bare branches, everything was etched in silver. The healer's shadow appeared, a long, distorted shape stretching out ahead, leading the way. The shadow carried the hump of the basket, looking like a weary pilgrim from another age. The cold deepened as the night reached its nadir. This was the wolf hour, the time between midnight and dawn when the earth's heat is lowest. The air was brittle, snapping with static. The trees popped loudly, sounded like rifle shots echoing through the valley. Crack. The sound was startling, but the healer did not flinch. It was just the sap freezing, the wood expanding. The healer reached a section of the forest where the trees were old birches. Their white bark shone in the moonlight, ghostly and pale. The strips of peeling bark fluttered in the wind, making a soft, dry rustling sound. Hiss, rustle, hiss. It sounded like whispering voices. The black eyes of the knots in the bark seemed to watch the healer pass. It was a hall of ghosts. Hunger returned, a gnawing emptiness in the stomach. The body was consuming itself for fuel. The healer grabbed a handful of clean snow from a branch, pressing it into a hard ball, eating it. The cold shock in the mouth was followed by the melting water. It offered hydration but stole heat. It was a calculated trade-off. The jaw worked slowly, grinding the ice crystals. The path began to descend again, leading toward the frozen river that marked the center of the home valley. The descent was easier on the lungs but harder on the knees. The quadriceps burned with the effort of breaking the weight. The healer's gait had become a shuffle, the feet barely lifting off the ground to conserve energy. The tracks left behind were two parallel furrows in the snow, like the trail of a sled. The river appeared as a broad, white highway winding through the trees. It was wider than the creek, a major artery of the forest. The ice was thick and snow-covered. The healer stepped onto it. The open space allowed the moonlight to flood the scene. It was bright enough to read by, a cold, clinical light. The far bank was a wall of dark pines, a mile away. The crossing of the river was a long, exposed march. The wind flowed down the river channel like water, a steady, freezing current. The healer walked in the center of the river, away from the treacherous shoreline ice. The shadow moved alongside, a silent companion. The isolation was total. There was no sign of life anywhere. No tracks, no birds, no sound but the wind. The healer was the last living thing on earth. The mind hallucinated gently. The smell of wood smoke seemed to drift past, though there was no fire. The sound of a door closing echoed in the wind. The healer shook the head, focusing on the texture of the snow. Look at the crystals. Look at the shadow. Keep the mind here. The river ice groaned, a deep tectonic rumble that vibrated through the boots. The ice was shifting, settling. It was a reminder of the power beneath the feet. The healer walked on, unfazed. The rhythm was everything. Step, breathe, step, breathe. The basket creaked. The wool swished. The cold pressed. Approaching the far bank, the healer saw the landmark, a massive, solitary oak tree that leaned out over the river. Its branches were gnarled and black against the moon. It marked the trail to the cabin. The healer adjusted the course, aiming for the tree. The bank was steep here, an undercut of frozen soil. The climb up the bank was the hardest physical exertion of the last hour. The healer had to use the axe, hooking the handle over an exposed root to pull up. The muscles trembled, the breath sobbed in the throat. Cresting the bank, the healer collapsed to the knees for a moment, head hanging. The snow was soft and inviting. The desire to sleep was a physical weight, pressing the eyelids down. Get up. The internal voice was harsh, a drill sergeant in the brain, get up or die. The healer forced the body to rise, the knees locked, the spine straightened. The journey continued. The cabin was close now, maybe 2 miles, an hour's walk. The forest on this side of the river was familiar. The healer knew these trees, that crooked pine, that boulder shaped like a bear. These were the neighbors. The familiarity offered a small psychological warmth. The end was in sight, but the cold was at its peak. The temperature had bottomed out. The air was a vacuum of heat. The healer's hands were no longer feeling anything. They were just hooks at the ends of the arms. The face was a mask of ice. The eyelashes were frozen shut again. The healer had to pry them apart with a stiff thumb. The vision was blurry, watery. The moonlight smeared into streaks of silver. The walk became a trance. The healer was not walking. The walking was happening to the healer. It was an automatic process, a biological machine functioning on its lowest setting. The conscious mind retreated deep inside, curling up around the memory of the fire. The body moved through the silver and black world, a dark shape in a landscape of light. The wind whispered in the pines. The snow crunched. The moon watched. The endurance was a silent scream of the will against the elements. The path leading away from the riverbank was not a road, nor even a trail in the conventional sense, but rather a memory etched into the landscape, a subtle corridor of reduced resistance known only to the feet of the one who had walked it for half a century. The forest here, on the homeward side of the water, possessed a different character than the wild, untamed timber of the old growth or the desolate expanse of the burn. These trees were familiar. They were the silent neighbors of a lifetime. There was the split birch, its twin trunks diverging from a single, massive root ball to frame a wedge of the star-filled sky. There was the kneeling pine, bent double by some storm in the distant past, its crown now permanently bowed toward the earth in a gesture of frozen reverence. The healer moved past them, acknowledging their presence not with a wave or a look, but with an internal nod of recognition, a slight easing of the tension in the chest. However, familiarity did not breed warmth. The temperature in this sector of the valley had settled into a profound stillness that defied measurement. It was a cold that felt ancient, a remnant of the ice ages that had shaped these hills. The air was so still that the passage of the healer created a wake, a disturbance in the density of the atmosphere that swirled behind the cloak. The moonlight, now high and bright, filtered through the canopy in distinct, tangible beams, pillars of silver light that stood solid in the darkness. Dust motes of ice suspended in the air glittered within these beams, turning the forest into a hall of mirrors, a place of shifting luminescence and deep, impenetrable shadow. The physical sensation of the body had altered again. The stage of acute pain, the stinging of the fingers, the burning of the toes, had passed hours ago. It had been replaced by a curious, detached state of existence. The healer no longer felt the feet striking the ground. Rather, the information was relayed through the vibration of the shin bones and the knees. The legs were mechanical pendulums, swinging from the hips with a hydraulic stiffness. The heavy wool trousers, frozen stiff at the cuffs where they had dragged in the snow, banged against the ankles with the sound of wood striking wood. The connection between the mind and the flesh was fraying, the signals traveling down long, cold wires that were losing their conductivity. The breathing remained the anchor. It was the only voluntary action left. Inhale through the nose, feeling the hairs stiffen and freeze. Hold the air, letting it warm slightly in the chest. Exhale through the mouth, pushing the gray ghost of vapor out into the moonlight. In, hold, out. The rhythm was slow, hypnotic, syncing with the crunch of the boots. The sound of the breath was loud in the silence, a harsh, rasping noise that seemed to belong to someone else, some unseen companion walking close behind. The healer reached a small clearing, a natural break in the canopy where a lightning strike had felled a cluster of maples years ago. The moon flooded this space with a brilliance that was almost blinding after the gloom of the trees. The snow here was pristine, a sheet of hammered silver, unbroken save for the single line of tracks that the healer was currently forging. The shadows of the surrounding trees fell across the clearing like the bars of a cage, long and black and sharp. As the healer walked, the shadow of the figure and the basket moved across the snow, a distorted, hunchbacked giant that mimicked every step. In the center of the clearing, the healer paused. It was a dangerous indulgence, this pausing. The momentum was a precious resource, hard to regain once lost, but the body demanded a moment of stasis. The healer leaned against the trunk of a standing dead tree, the rough bark gripping the wool of the cloak. The basket rested against the wood, taking the weight off the spine. The relief was instantaneous and overwhelming, a wave of pleasure that washed over the exhaustion. The eyes closed, just for a moment. In the darkness behind the eyelids, the world spun gently. Images from the day flashed by in a chaotic slideshow, the red of the winter berries, the white of the frost fungi, the black of the river water. Then other images intruded. Warmth, the yellow light of the hearth, the smell of hot broth, the softness of the quilt. The mind began to drift, untethering itself from the frozen reality. It would be so easy to slide down the trunk of this tree, to sit in the snow, to wrap the cloak tight and just sleep. The snow looked soft. It looked like a bed. The healer's head snapped up. The neck cracked. The eyes opened, wide and staring. No, the word was not spoken, but it screamed in the mind. The sleep was the enemy. The comfort was a lie. The healer pushed away from the tree, the muscles protesting the renewed effort. The basket settled back onto the shoulders, a burden of duty that could not be laid down. The walk resumed. The pace was slower now, the legs heavy as lead, but they moved. The path left the clearing and dipped into a hollow. This was the cold sink. It was a depression in the land where the coldest air in the valley collected, pooling like water. Entering it was like walking into a wall of solid ice. The temperature dropped another 5 degrees in the span of 10 yards. The air here was thick, viscous. The moisture in the breath froze instantly upon exiting the mouth, falling as a fine snow on the front of the cloak. The trees in the hollow were coated in a thick layer of hoarfrost, their branches turning into plumes of white coral. The silence in the cold sink was heavy, pressurized. It pressed against the eardrums. The sound of the boots was muffled here, the snow soft and dry like flour. The healer moved through this white, frozen garden like a ghost. The frost-covered branches brushed against the cloak with a whispering sound. Hush, hush, hush. The world was holding a finger to its lips. The healer's vision began to tunnel again. The peripheral details blurred into a gray fog. The focus narrowed to the immediate foreground, the texture of the bark on the nearest tree, the glint of a singular ice crystal on a snowdrift. The mind obsessed over small details to stay awake. The pattern of the weave in the mitten, the scratch on the leather of the satchel, the exact shade of blue in the shadow of a footprint. These micro-observations were the handholds that kept the consciousness from slipping into the abyss. The weight of the harvest was a constant physical reality. The basket was not just heavy, it was a complex mass of shifting weights. The dense, wet roots of the marshmallow lay at the bottom, a solid anchor. The bark of the willow and the spruce tips filled the middle, a shifting cargo that rustled with every step. The light, bulky sack of usnea moss tied to the outside caught the wind, acting as a sail that tugged gently at the shoulders. The healer could feel the individual components of the load, visualizing them in the darkness behind the back. Each item was a promise of healing, a unit of future warmth and relief. This knowledge was the fuel that powered the legs. The path began to rise out of the hollow, climbing a gentle ridge. The exertion of the climb warmed the blood slightly, sending a faint prickle of life into the extremities. The healer welcomed the pain. Pain was life. Numbness was the danger. The ridge was topped with a stand of ancient hemlocks, their branches interlocking to form a tunnel. The moonlight could not penetrate here. The darkness returned, absolute and velvety. Walking in the dark again required a shift in sensory processing. The healer reached out with the senses of hearing and touch. The echo of the footsteps against the tree trunks told the distance to the obstacles. The feeling of the air currents against the exposed skin of the face indicated the direction of the slope. The feet felt the angle of the ground, adjusting the stride length automatically. It was a primal mode of navigation, a regression to an animal state. Deep in the hemlock tunnel, a sound broke the silence. It was the call of a great horned owl. Hoo-ha-choo, hoo-ha-choo. The sound was deep, resonant, vibrating through the timber. It came from somewhere high above in the invisible rafters of the forest. The healer did not stop, but the heart beat a little faster. The owl was a watcher, a sentinel of the night. To hear it was a sign of what the healer did not know, but it felt significant. A reminder that life persisted even in this frozen tomb. The tunnel opened up and the healer stepped out onto the upper plateau. The view here was expansive. The moon was high now, a stark white spotlight. The valley floor lay below, a tapestry of silver and charcoal. The healer could see the line of the river, a ribbon of white winding through the darkness. And there, far ahead, tucked into the fold of the land, was the destination. Not the cabin itself. It was hidden by the trees, but the shape of the land where it sat. The familiarity of the horizon line was a comfort. The wind returned on the plateau. It was a clean, steady wind from the north, carrying the scent of snow that had fallen 1,000 miles away. It stripped the stagnant air of the hollow from the cloak, refreshing the senses with its bite. The healer pulled the hood tighter, bowing the head against the draft. The wind chill was severe, but it was a cleansing cold. The final leg of the journey approached. The path led through a dense thicket of black spruce. These trees were short, stunted, and incredibly dense. They grew so close together that their branches interwove into a solid wall. The trail was a narrow tunnel cut through this living mass. To enter it was to be embraced by the forest. The boughs brushed against the shoulders, the hips, the basket. The smell of spruce resin was overpowering here, sharp and medicinal. The healer entered the spruce tunnel. The snow here was deep, drifted into the narrow passage. The walking was a struggle. The legs had to lift high, plunging into the drifts. The snow fell into the tops of the boots, melting against the socks and refreezing. The dampness was a new misery. The healer gritted the teeth, the jaw muscles aching with the tension. Lift, step, plunge, lift, step, plunge. The darkness in the thicket was textured. The moonlight caught the needles, turning them into millions of tiny silver needles. The snow was a chaotic jumble of shadows and highlights. The healer's eyes played tricks. Shapes seemed to move in the peripheral vision. Shadow wolves, shadow bears, spirits of the winter. The healer ignored them. They were born of fatigue and optics. The only reality was the path. The internal monologue had ceased. There were no more words in the mind, only a rhythmic pulse of will. Go, go, go. The body was a machine that was breaking down, the gears grinding, the oil congealing. But the flywheel still spun. The momentum carried the figure forward. The healer was no longer a person. They were a force of nature, a vector of movement through the night. A branch slapped the healer in the face, a stinging lash of frozen needles. The shock was sharp. The healer stopped, blinking the watering eyes. The hand came up to touch the cheek. It felt like touching a piece of cold rubber. There was no pain, just the impact. The healer wiped the moisture away, checking the glove for blood. It was too dark to see. It didn't matter, keep moving. The spruce thicket began to thin. The trees became spaced further apart. The grip of the forest loosened. The healer stepped out of the tunnel and onto the edge of the home clearing. The transition was abrupt. One moment, the oppressive enclosure of the trees; the next, the open sky and the flat expanse of the meadow. And there it was, the cabin. It was a dark shape against the trees on the far side of the clearing. It looked small, insignificant against the vastness of the night and the forest. A humble stack of logs, a slanted roof heavy with snow. No light shone from the window, the fire had died down to coals hours ago. No smoke rose from the chimney, or if it did, it was invisible against the night sky. But it was there. It was solid. It was home. The sight of the cabin did not bring a rush of energy. Instead, it brought a wave of profound weakness. The adrenaline that had sustained the march began to fade, replaced by the crushing weight of the accumulated fatigue. The legs trembled. The knees felt like water. The distance across the clearing, perhaps 200 yards, looked like an ocean. The healer started across the open ground. The snow was knee-deep here, untouched by the wind. It was a slow, wading slog. The cabin did not seem to get closer. It remained a distant object, a mirage. The healer focused on the door, the dark rectangle of the wood, the iron latch. That was the goal. Reach the latch. The wind in the clearing was swirling, blowing the snow around the boots. The healer's shadow stretched out toward the cabin, touching the wall before the body did. The moon watched from its high throne, cold and indifferent. The stars glittered, hard and sharp. The universe was vast and cold, and the healer was a tiny, warm spark struggling to reach the safety of the wooden box. The sound of the boots crunching in the snow was the only sound in the world. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The breath came in sobbing gasps now. The chest burned. The shoulders screamed under the straps. The basket felt like it contained stones, not herbs. 50 yards. The details of the cabin became visible. The rough texture of the hewn logs. The icicles hanging from the eaves, long and sharp like teeth. The dark glass of the window reflecting the moon. The woodpile stacked against the wall, covered in a drift. 20 yards. The smell of the cabin reached the nose, a faint scent of wood smoke and old timber. It was the smell of safety. It gave the healer the final ounce of strength needed. 10 yards. The healer stumbled, falling to one knee. The snow was cold against the hand. The basket shifted, hitting the back of the head. The healer stayed there for a second, breathing into the snow. Get up. The command was faint. The body obeyed slowly, painfully. The healer rose, swaying like a drunkard. The final few steps were a blur. The hand reached out, the glove touching the rough wood of the doorframe. It was real. It was solid. The healer leaned against the door, the forehead resting on the cold wood. The journey was not over. The fire had to be revived, the herbs stored, the body warmed, but the walk was done. The forest had been traversed. The harvest was home. The healer stood there for a long minute, just breathing, feeling the solid structure of the cabin against the body. The wind whistled around the corner of the building, a final, impotent threat. The cold pressed against the back, trying to force its way in. But the door was there, the barrier between the wild and the tame. With a trembling hand, the healer reached for the latch. The metal was frozen, biting through the leather of the glove. The thumb pressed the lever. Click. The sound was loud, mechanical, final. The door was unlatched. The sanctuary awaited. But before entering, the healer turned one last time to look back at the forest. The clearing, the spruce thicket, the ridge, the dark wall of trees, it all lay silent under the moon. The tracks of the approach were a winding dark line in the silver snow, the only evidence of the struggle. The forest was indifferent. It had permitted the passage, but it had not made it easy. It would be there tomorrow. It would be there forever. The healer turned back to the door. The shoulder pushed. The ice on the threshold cracked. The door swung inward, revealing the absolute darkness of the interior, a darkness that smelled of home. The healer stepped over the threshold, dragging the heavy boots, the heavy cloak, the heavy basket. The door was pulled shut. The latch clicked home. The wind was cut off. The silence of the cabin was different. It was a warm silence, a contained silence. The walk was over. The darkness inside the cabin was not the empty, expansive void of the night outside. It was a solid, contained substance, heavy with the scent of stagnant wood smoke, dry pine, and the subtle, dusty smell of dried herbs. The silence that followed the latching of the door was absolute, a sudden amputation of the wind's roar that left the ears ringing with a phantom frequency. The healer stood with their back against the door, the heavy oak planks vibrating slightly with the last gust of the gale that had been shut out. The transition from the hostile, moving atmosphere of the forest to the still, dead air of the room was a physical shock. The body, braced for the constant assault of the wind, suddenly found itself pushing against nothing. The muscles trembled, a violent, involuntary shivering that started in the core and radiated out to the extremities, rattling the teeth and making the knees knock together in the heavy wool trousers. For a long time there was no movement. The healer simply existed in the dark, breathing the still air. It was cold inside, freezing in fact, but it was a dry, stable cold. There was no wind chill to strip the heat away faster than the body could generate it. The temperature was perhaps 10 degrees below freezing, but compared to the exterior world, it felt like a reprieve. The eyes, adjusting from the stark, silver moonlight of the snow to the total blackness of the interior, saw nothing. The memory of the room, however, was perfect. The healer knew the distance to the table, the location of the chair, the angle of the hearth. The first task was the burden. The basket, strapped to the back for hours, had become a parasitic extension of the body, its weight fused to the spine. The healer reached up with hands that felt like blocks of wood, fumbling for the buckles of the shoulder straps. The leather was stiff, frozen into the shape of the curve over the shoulder. The metal tongues of the buckles were biting cold. The fingers slipped, scratched, and struggled. It was a clumsy, desperate battle in the dark. Finally, one strap gave way. The weight shifted lopsidedly, pulling the healer to the left. Then the second strap. The basket slid down the back, the wicker creaking against the wool of the cloak. It hit the floor with a heavy, muffled thump and a rattle of the contents. The sudden release of weight was dizzying. The healer felt like they were floating, the spine uncoiling, the shoulders rising toward the ears. The healer stepped away from the door, the boots thudding heavily on the floorboards. The sound was dull and flat. The destination was the hearth. It was the center of the universe. The healer moved with the shuffling gait of the exhaustion, hands outstretched to feel for the back of the chair, the edge of the table. The darkness was textured by touch, the rough wood, the smooth pottery, the cold stone of the chimney. Kneeling before the hearth was an act of torture. The knees, stiffened by the cold and the miles of hiking, refused to bend smoothly. They ratcheted down, the joints grinding. The healer hit the floor hard, the impact jarring the teeth. Leaning forward, the hands groped for the iron poker. The metal was freezing, burning the skin like dry ice. The healer found the pile of ash. It was cold on the surface. The excavation began. The poker pushed aside the gray dust, digging for the heart. The anxiety was a cold knot in the stomach. Had the fire died? Had the coal gone out? If it had, the process of restarting it with frozen hands, striking flint and steel in the dark, would be a nightmare. The poker hit something solid. The healer pushed deeper. A faint, dull red glow appeared at the bottom of the ash pile. It was tiny, no larger than a hazelnut, a single eye of heat blinking in the gray ruin. But it was alive. The healer dropped the poker and leaned in, face inches from the ash. The breath was the bellows. A long, steady exhalation was directed at the coal. The ash swirled up, coating the face, getting in the eyes. The coal glowed brighter, turning from dull red to angry orange. The heat on the face was faint but distinct. The healer reached for the kindling box, feeling for the birch bark. A strip was torn off, the sound sharp in the quiet. It was placed on the coal. The weight was agonizing. The bark curled, smoked, and blackened. The healer blew again, a desperate, steady stream of air. Please. The word was not spoken, but it hung in the air. Then a snap. A tiny tongue of blue flame licked the edge of the bark. It grew, catching the oils in the birch. Yellow light flared up, pushing back the darkness. The shadows of the andirons leapt up the back of the chimney. The room was revealed in flashes of warm, amber light. The rough logs of the walls, the hanging bundles of herbs, the table, the bed. It was a painting in chiaroscuro, deep blacks and rich golds. The healer added small twigs, then larger sticks. The fire took hold. The crackle of the wood was the most beautiful sound in the world. It was the sound of life returning. The light steadied, casting a warm, pulsating glow across the floorboards. The healer remained kneeling, hands held out toward the flames. The gloves were still on. The leather was steaming slightly as the moisture in it evaporated. The heat began to penetrate the layers, a slow, prickly sensation. Now the delayering. This was a process of shedding the armor. The healer sat on the hearth rug, a braided oval of old wool rags. The cloak came first. The clasp was undone. The heavy wool garment was lifted off the shoulders. It was stiff, holding its shape like a carapace. The hem was frozen solid, a ring of ice and snow pellets. The healer stood it up against the wall. It did not collapse, but stood there like a headless sentry, slowly dripping onto the floor. The satchel was removed next, placed gently on the table. Then the vest, the tunic. The layers were peeled away, revealing the body underneath. The healer was left in the linen undershirt and the heavy wool trousers. The air in the room, though still cold, felt warm against the skin compared to the outside. But the true trial was the boots. The healer sat on the floor, extending one leg. The laces were frozen into a solid mass of ice. They could not be untied. The healer had to lean close to the fire, holding the boot near the flames to thaw the leather strips. The smell of wet leather and beeswax filled the air. Slowly, the ice melted. The laces softened. The healer worked the knots loose, the fingers clumsy and stiff. Pulling the boot off required a massive effort. The heel stuck. The healer grunted, pulling, twisting. With a suction-like pop, the boot came free. The sock underneath was damp with sweat and melted snow. The steam rose from the foot in the cold air. The toes were white and waxy, devoid of blood. The second boot followed. The relief of the feet was instant, followed immediately by the pain of the thaw. As the blood rushed back into the constricted capillaries of the feet and hands, the sensation was not warmth but fire. It was the screaming barfies, a deep, nauseating ache that throbbed in rhythm with the heart. It felt as if the bones were expanding, shattering the skin. The healer groaned, rocking back and forth on the floor, holding the feet. It was a necessary pain, the price of survival. The healer gritted the teeth, riding out the waves of agony. Throb, burn, throb, burn. The fire crackled, indifferent to the suffering. The shadows danced on the walls. The room was slowly warming, the air currents shifting as the heat rose to the rafters. The icicles on the inside of the window pane began to weep, sliding down the glass, leaving trails of water. After the pain subsided to a dull, manageable ache, the healer stood. The feet were tender, bruised. The healer walked to the washstand, moving gingerly. The water in the pitcher was frozen, of course, a solid block of ice in the ceramic vessel. The healer picked up the iron kettle from the hearth, which had been left empty. Taking a metal scoop, the healer went to the bucket of clean snow kept by the door. The scoop crunched into the snow. The kettle was filled with the white powder. The kettle was placed on the hook over the fire. The snow began to hiss as it touched the hot metal. Melting snow for water was a slow process. The volume reduced drastically as it turned to liquid. It would take many scoops to fill the kettle. The healer tended to this mechanically. Scoop, fill, melt, scoop, fill, melt. The promise of hot water for tea, for washing, for heat was the motivation. While the water heated, the healer turned to the harvest. The basket sat in the middle of the floor, a dark, woven island. The healer lifted it onto the table. The wood of the table was scarred and stained, a map of past harvests. The lamp on the table was lit, a small oil lamp that added a pool of steady white light to the flickering orange of the fire. The unpacking was a ritual. It had to be done now. The plants were living things or dying things, and they needed care. To leave them in the basket overnight would be to risk rot or mold. The healer reached in. First, the usnea moss. The sack was untied. The gray-green tufts were pulled out, dry and dusty. They were spread onto a wooden drying rack near the fire, but not too close. They needed air circulation. The texture of the moss was like old hair, brittle and fine. The healer picked out the pine needles and bits of bark, cleaning the harvest. Next, the winterberries. The small bag was emptied into a ceramic bowl. The red berries clicked against the pottery like glass beads. They were bright, shocking spots of color in the brown and gray room. They would be dried for tea or mashed into a poultice. The healer ran a hand through them, checking for shriveled ones. The cold still radiated from them. The willow bark strips were laid out on a cloth. They were curling as they dried. The inner bark was turning a rusty brown. The smell of aspirin was faint but sharp. The healer straightened them, aligning them in rows like soldiers. Finally, the roots. The marshmallow roots were the prize, but they were a mess. Covered in the black mud of the fen, they were heavy and wet. They could not be stored like this. The healer took a stiff brush and a basin. Using the last of the liquid water from a reserve jar, the healer began to scrub the roots. The water turned black instantly. The mud was tenacious, clinging to the crevices. The healer scrubbed, the sound of the bristles on the root scratching in the quiet room. Scrub, splash, scrub. The roots emerged from the mud pale and ghostly, like the fingers of a skeleton. The healer took a knife and sliced them into discs. The white flesh of the root was mucilaginous, sticky to the touch. The slices were laid out on a drying screen. This task required focus, the knife moving close to the tired fingers. The healer moved slowly, deliberately. Slice, place, slice, place. The kettle on the fire began to sing, a low, rising whistle that announced the boil. The sound was domestic, comforting. The healer stopped the work, wiping the sticky starch from the hands onto a rag. The mug was waiting. A pinch of dried mint and nettle from a jar on the shelf was dropped into the bottom. The healer lifted the kettle with a thick pad of cloth. The water was poured. The steam rose up, a vertical column of white cloud that mushroomed against the ceiling beams. The smell of the herbs hitting the hot water was the smell of summer, a sudden, olfactory hallucination of green fields and warm sun. The healer leaned into the steam, inhaling deeply. The moisture soothed the dry, cracked mucous membranes of the nose and throat. Holding the hot mug, the healer walked back to the chair by the fire. This was the first true sit. The body collapsed into the wood. The spine curved, molding to the backrest. The legs were extended toward the fire, the feet now throbbing with a comfortable warmth. The hands wrapped around the ceramic mug, soaking up the heat. The first sip of the tea was a revelation. It scalded the tongue, but the heat traveling down the esophagus was a physical sensation of thawing from the inside out. The liquid hit the stomach, radiating warmth through the core. The healer closed the eyes, letting the head fall back. The tension in the neck muscles released with a series of small pops. The room was quiet save for the fire. The logs shifted, settling into the bed of coals with a soft crash and a shower of sparks. The wind outside was a distant memory, a muffled pressure against the walls. Here there was light. Here there was heat. Here there was safety. The healer opened the eyes and looked at the harvest on the table. The red berries, the pale roots, the gray moss. It was a good haul. The pain of the day, the cold of the crossing, the weight of the basket, it was all transmuted into these small piles of matter. Medicine. Life. It was a fair trade. But the work was not quite done. The body needed food. The hunger, suppressed by the adrenaline of the return, came roaring back. It was a hollow, aching void in the center of the being. The healer stood, groaning at the protest of the quadriceps. The stew pot hung on a hook in the corner. It contained the remnants of yesterday's meal, a thick broth of root vegetables and venison. It was frozen solid, a brown puck in the bottom of the iron pot. The pot was swung over the fire next to the kettle. The heat began to work on the frozen mass. The smell of the stew began to rise, mixing with the scent of the drying herbs and the wood smoke. It was a heavy, savory smell. The healer stood by the fire, stirring the pot as it melted, watching the brown liquid bubble and thicken. The spoon scraped the bottom of the pot. Scrape, stir, scrape. The healer ate standing up, leaning against the mantel. The stew was hot, salty, and rich. It filled the void, providing the calories needed to repair the damage of the day. The body absorbed it greedily. With every spoonful, the fog in the brain cleared a little. The trembling in the hands ceased. The world became solid again. The fire was roaring now. The room was fully heated. The shadows were pushed back to the very corners. The frost on the window had melted into a pool of water on the sill. The healer took a rag and wiped it up, wringing the water into the slop bucket. The window was now black glass, a mirror reflecting the room. The healer caught a glimpse of their own reflection, a tired, lined face, hair matted with hat hair, eyes deep set and shadowed, a ghost in the glass. The healer turned away from the window. The reflection was not important. The reality was the room. The healer moved the drying racks closer to the fire, but not too close. The temperature had to be regulated. Too hot and the volatile oils would evaporate. Too cool and the mold would strike. It was a delicate balance. The healer added a large log to the fire. A night log. It was a round of oak, unsplit, dense and heavy. It would burn slow and long, holding the coals until morning. The fire accepted the offering, the flames licking up the sides of the rough bark. The weight of the log settled the fire, damping the flames but increasing the heat mass. The healer looked around the room. The basket was empty. The boots were drying. The cloak was hanging. The herbs were safe. The belly was full. The door was barred. The list was complete. The duty was discharged. Now and only now could the mind truly let go. The vigilance that had been maintained for 12 hours, the constant scanning of the terrain, the monitoring of the body, the calculation of the risks, could be switched off. The silence of the room was no longer a lack of noise. It was a presence of peace. It was a heavy, woolen blanket of quiet that covered everything. The healer moved to the bed. The furs were piled high, a chaotic mound of wolf and bear skins. They looked inviting, a nest of softness, but not yet. There was one final task: the journal, the record. The healer sat at the table, pulling a heavy, leather-bound book from the shelf. The pages were parchment, thick and yellow. The ink was made from oak galls and iron. The quill was a goose feather trimmed sharp. The healer dipped the pen. The hand shook slightly, then steadied. Date midwinter. Weather clear, heavy frost, wind northwest. Harvest winterberry, willow, althea, usnea. Note, the ice on the beaver pond is singing. The wolf tracks were seen in the burn. The cold is deep. The scratching of the pen was loud in the room. The ink glistened wetly in the lamplight before sinking into the paper. The words were brief, factual. They were the only testimony to the day's struggle. The history of the forest was written in these lines. The healer closed the book. The ink was dry. The day was captured. The healer blew out the lamp. The white light vanished, leaving only the warm, orange glow of the fire. The shadows jumped back into the room, reclaiming the corners. The world was reduced to the hearth and the bed. The healer walked to the bed. The trousers were removed, leaving only the linen shirt. The skin was pale, goose-fleshed in the cooler air away from the fire. The healer climbed into the bed, pulling the heavy furs up to the chin. The weight of the bedding was immense, pressing the body down into the mattress of straw and feathers. The pillow was cold. The healer turned the cheek into it. The body began to generate its own microclimate under the furs. The warmth built up, trapping itself in the pockets of air. The muscles of the legs twitched, releasing the stored tension. The back unknotted. The eyes closed. The sound of the fire was a lullaby. Pop, hiss, crackle. The wind outside was a distant rumor. The healer lay still, staring at the flicker of light on the ceiling beams. The mind emptied. The images of the snow and the ice faded. There was only the warmth. There was only the rest. The deep, heavy sleep of the winter was waiting. The stillness of the bed was not merely a lack of movement. It was a physical terrain, a landscape of soft, yielding contours that rose to meet the exhausted body. The mattress, stuffed with the down of geese and the dried straw of the summer fields, accepted the weight of the healer with a slow, rustling sigh. It was a deep, enveloping embrace, a sinking into a substrate that felt ancient and forgiving. The furs that were piled on top, the heavy pelts of bear and wolf, the thick, scratchy quilts of wool, formed a geological layer of warmth, pressing down with a gravity that was both crushing and comforting. The healer lay beneath this mountain of insulation, a fossil encased in sedimentary rock, safe from the erosion of the wind and the cold. The room beyond the edge of the covers was beginning to cool. The fire, though banked with the heavy oak log, had passed its peak of radiative violence. The flames, which had danced and leaped with frantic energy earlier, had now settled into a low, hypnotic undulation. They were no longer sheets of yellow fire, but tongues of deep, viscous orange that licked the charred underside of the wood with a slow, sensual rhythm. The light they cast was different now. It was heavier, dimmer, a somber red-gold illumination that did not reach the corners of the room. The corners had been reclaimed by the shadows. These shadows were not empty. They were thick, textured pools of darkness that seemed to breathe with the room. They stretched out from the base of the walls, from behind the wardrobe, from under the table, inching across the floorboards like a slow, rising tide of ink. The healer lay on the back, eyes half open, watching the play of this dying light on the ceiling beams. The wood of the ceiling was dark, stained by decades of smoke. The light caught the rough edges of the adze marks, creating a topography of ridges and valleys that shifted as the fire flickered. It was a silent movie, a projection of the elemental struggle in the hearth played out on the screen of the roof. The healer watched it with a detached, floating consciousness. The mind was no longer driving the body. It was merely a passenger, observing the slow shutdown of the biological machine. The sensation of the cold was still present, but it was distant now, a memory stored in the nerves rather than an immediate threat. The tips of the toes, which had been blocks of ice, were now throbbing with a dull, rhythmic heat. It was a heavy, pulsing sensation, the blood forcing its way back into the smallest vessels, expanding the tissues, reclaiming the territory lost to the winter. The healer wiggled them slightly, feeling the rough texture of the wool socks against the smooth linen of the sheets. The friction was a small, grounding detail in the drifting void. The sounds of the cabin were the heartbeat of the night. As the temperature outside dropped further, plunging toward the absolute zero of the deep wolf hour, the structure of the building reacted. The heavy logs, contracted by the freeze, groaned. It was a deep, resonant sound, a bass note that vibrated through the floor and up the legs of the bed. Crrr-riek. Then silence. Then, from the roof, the sharp pop of a rafter adjusting to the load of the snow. These were not sounds of distress. They were the sounds of endurance. The cabin was a living thing, shifting its weight, settling its bones against the cold. The healer knew every creak, every groan. They were the lullaby of the home. Outside, the wind had changed its voice again. It was no longer the howling gale of the crossing, nor the whistling draft of the ridge. It had become a low, constant hum, a vibration that pressed against the entire surface of the north wall. It was the sound of a massive, heavy air mass moving slowly over the earth. Occasionally, a gust would catch the chimney, creating a hollow, flute-like note that echoed in the hearth. Woo-ho-woo. The sound was lonely, mournful, the voice of a ghost wandering the white wastes. But inside, it only served to underscore the safety of the bed. The contrast was the luxury. The colder the wind sounded, the warmer the furs felt. The healer's breathing had slowed to a tidal rhythm. Inhale. The air in the room was cool, smelling of ozone and pine smoke. It entered the nose, traveled down the throat, and filled the lungs with a clean, sharp draft. Exhale. The warm, moist air left the body, creating a tiny, invisible cloud in the dark. The pause between the exhale and the next inhale grew longer. It was a suspension of time, a moment where the heart rested. Beat, beat, beat. The pulse was slow, heavy, a drum muffled by thick velvet. The mind began to untether itself from the linear progression of time. The events of the day did not replay as a narrative, but as a series of sensory impressions, disconnected and floating. The flash of the red winterberry against the gray sky, the smell of the black mud in the fen, the sound of the ice cracking on the river, the feeling of the rough bark of the hemlock. These images drifted past like leaves on a slow stream. They carried no emotional weight, no urgency. They were just data filed away in the archives of the memory. The healer observed them without judgment. There is the berry. There is the ice. There is the mud. The scent of the drying herbs began to permeate the room more strongly as the air stilled. The warmth of the fire had released the volatile oils from the willow bark and the nettle. A faint, medicinal smell, bitter and clean, hung over the bed. It was the smell of the forest brought indoors, a reminder of the task completed. The healer inhaled it, and it felt like breathing in the essence of the work. The boundary between the healer and the herbs dissolved. The healer was the forest was the healer. There was no separation. The fire settled again. A log collapsed into the coal bed with a soft, crumbling sound. A shower of sparks shot up the chimney, invisible to the eyes now closed. The light in the room dropped a notch. The orange faded to a deep, brooding crimson. The shadows on the ceiling merged, swallowing the beams. The room was becoming a cave, a womb of darkness. The only light remaining was the faint glow of the coals, reflected dimly in the glass of the window, a red eye watching from the wall. The healer's body felt incredibly heavy, as if the gravity in the room had doubled. The arms, resting at the sides, felt like they were sinking through the mattress. The legs were leaden. The head was a stone on the pillow. This heaviness was not unpleasant, it was a release. The tension that had held the muscles tight for 12 hours, the bracing against the wind, the balancing on the ice, the lifting of the basket, was finally letting go. The knots in the shoulders unraveled. The tightness in the lower back dissolved. The body was turning to liquid, melting into the bed. Sleep paralysis began to set in, the natural mechanism of the body locking itself down for the repair cycle. The healer felt the limbs becoming distant, remote. If the mind commanded the hand to move, the hand would not respond. It belonged to the bed now. This surrender of control was the final gateway. The conscious mind, the captain of the vessel, stepped away from the wheel, handing control over to the deep, silent autopilot of the autonomic system. The dream state approached not as a sudden shift, but as a gradual coloring of the darkness. The black void behind the eyelids began to acquire texture. It looked like the surface of a charcoal drawing, grainy and soft. Shapes began to emerge from the grain, vague, shifting forms that resembled trees or clouds or drifting snow. The healer was walking again, but without effort. There was no cold. There was no weight. The basket was gone. The boots were gone. The healer was floating over the snow, moving through the forest of the mind. In this hypnagogic state, the forest was not the gray, frozen world of the day. It was a place of deep, rich colors seen in low light. The pine needles were a luminous dark emerald. The snow was a glowing indigo. The sky was a tapestry of velvet stars. The healer moved through the trees, touching them without hands. The trees hummed, a vibration that matched the sound of the wind in the chimney. It was a connection, a network of life that existed beneath the ice. The roots of the maples, the mycelium of the fungi, the burrowing animals, they were all visible in this dream vision, glowing with a faint internal light. The healer drifted down through the layers of the earth, passing through the snow, through the frozen crust into the deep, dark soil. Here in the warm dark, the roots of the world were sleeping. The great taproots of the oaks, the tangled mats of the spruce, the white, fleshy fingers of the marshmallow. They were dormant, waiting, holding their energy in tight, condensed coils. The healer rested among them, feeling their slow, rhythmic pulse. This was the source. This was the battery of the spring. To sleep here was to recharge. The reality of the cabin faded to a thin, translucent shell. The sound of the wind became the sound of the earth breathing. The crackle of the fire became the sound of the roots growing. The healer was no longer a person in a bed. The healer was a seed in the ground, wrapped in a husk of warmth, waiting out the long winter. The concept of I began to dissolve. There was only the existence, the being, the resting. Time in the room stretched and warped. The intervals between the settling noises of the wood grew longer. The fire burned down to a bed of ash-covered coals, preserving its heat in a secret, glowing core. The temperature in the room stabilized at a cool, preservation-level chill. The frost began to creep back onto the window pane, reclaiming the glass. It grew in feathery, fern-like patterns, crystallizing the moisture in the air. The window became a masterpiece of ice art, opaque and beautiful, sealing the cabin off from the outside world completely. The healer shifted slightly in the sleep, a microscopic adjustment of the head on the pillow. The movement was slow, fluid, like seaweed moving in a tide. The breath let out a small, soft sound, a sigh that was absorbed instantly by the heavy quilts. The rhythm of the breathing deepened further, becoming barely perceptible. The metabolic rate dropped. The heart beat 40 times a minute. The body was in hibernation mode. The darkness in the room was now total, save for the faintest dull red glow from the hearth, a light so weak it barely registered on the retina. It was a darkness of infinite depth. It felt soft, like black wool. It filled the ears, the nose, the mouth. It was a sensory deprivation tank, removing all input so the mind could heal. The silence was a heavy liquid that filled the room from floor to ceiling. Deep in the subconscious, the healer revisited the harvest. The hands in the dream were cleaning the roots again, but the water was warm. The mud washed away easily, revealing pure gold underneath. The berries were rubies. The moss was spun silver. The work was effortless. The result was perfect. The anxiety of the day, the fear of the cold, the fear of the shortage, the fear of the dark was washed away. There was only the abundance. The pantry was full. The fire was lit. The duty was done. The night deepened. The constellation of Orion wheeled slowly overhead, invisible through the roof but felt in the alignment of the world. The earth turned on its axis, carrying the sleeping healer through the vast, cold ocean of space. The cabin was a tiny ship, a capsule of life, traveling through the void. The healer was the passenger, asleep in the stasis pod. The wind outside died down for a moment, leaving a silence so profound that it woke a part of the primitive brain. The healer stirred, the eyes fluttering but not opening. The ears strained into the quiet. Is it there? Is the wolf there? The silence held. Then the wind returned, a soft, reassuring brush against the logs. It is there. The world is still there. The healer sank back down, deeper than before. The warmth of the bed had now reached a perfect equilibrium. The body heat, trapped by the layers of fur and wool, had created a microclimate of tropical warmth. The skin was relaxed, the pores open. The contrast with the cold nose and the cold air in the lungs was a delicious sensation. It defined the comfort. Without the cold air, the warm bed would be meaningless. The duality was the pleasure. The shadows in the room ceased to move. The fire was now a static entity, a bed of red heat without flame. The light was constant, a faint, bloody twilight that would last until dawn. The room was fixed in time. The furniture stood sentinel, the chair, the table, the cupboard. They watched the sleeper with the patience of inanimate objects. They had seen this 1,000 times. The return, the fire, the sleep. They would see it 1,000 times more. The healer's dream shifted again. Now the healer was standing on the ridge looking out over the valley. But there was no snow, it was summer. The valley was a sea of green. The air was thick with pollen and heat. The birds were singing a deafening chorus. The sun was a hammer of gold. The healer stood there, feeling the heat soak into the bones, storing it up. This was the memory of the sun, the promise of the return. The winter was a season, not an eternity. The wheel would turn. The ice would melt. The roots would wake. But for now, the ice was the truth. The dream faded, returning the healer to the warm dark of the roots. The sleep became dreamless, a blank black slate. This was the delta wave sleep, the restorative depth where the body repairs the tears in the muscle, the cracks in the skin, the fatigue in the mind. It was a dark water, cool and deep. The healer sank into it, submerged completely. The sound of the house settling came again, a loud crack from the floorboards near the door. The healer did not stir. The conscious mind was too far down to hear it. The sound rippled through the air and died against the furs. The silence rushed back in, healing the tear in the quiet. The heavy woolen cloak, hanging by the door, dripped the last drop of meltwater onto the floor. Drip. A tiny sound, a period at the end of the sentence of the day. The puddle on the floor froze, turning into a small, flat mirror of black ice. The cold crept in under the door, a thin layer of heavier air that slid along the floorboards, seeking the fire. It met the warmth of the hearth and curled upward, joining the draft. The circulation of the room continued, a slow, invisible cycle of air that kept the sleeper alive. The healer slept. It was a sleep of granite and iron, a sleep of the mountains. The breathing was a slow bellows fanning the spark of life deep in the chest. The heart beat on, a steady, rhythmic drum in the silence. The night was long. The path was hidden. The forest was asleep. Hours passed. The moon moved across the window, its light tracking across the floorboards like the hand of a clock. It touched the leg of the table, then the rug, then the post of the bed. It climbed the furs, illuminating the shape of the sleeper, a mound of dark fur rising and falling, a hand, calloused and stained, resting on the quilt, a face relaxed and smoothed of lines, half buried in the pillow. The moonlight was cold, blue, and indifferent. It did not wake the sleeper. It simply verified the presence. Here is a life. The wind picked up again, a fresh gust from the north. It shook the eaves. It rattled the door. The cabin held. The logs were strong. The moss chinking was tight. The sanctuary was secure. The healer slept on, unaware of the wind, unaware of the moon, unaware of the cold. There was only the warmth. There was only the dark. There was only the peace of the winter night. The night had now settled into its deepest groove, a vast, silent canyon of time situated between the death of the yesterday and the birth of the tomorrow. It was the hour of the wolf, the hour of the ghost, the hour when the rotation of the earth seems to pause on its axis, grinding against the friction of the absolute cold. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere had thickened, congealing into a substance that was heavier than air, a medium that supported the silence like water supports a stone. The darkness was no longer a lack of light. It was a physical presence, a soft, velvety accumulation of soot and shadow that filled the room from the floorboards to the rafters, pressing gently against the walls, sealing the sleeper in a capsule of timelessness. The fire in the hearth had undergone a transformation. The flames, those frantic, dancing spirits of yellow and blue that had entertained the early evening, were gone. In their place lay the true heart of the winter fire, a massive monolithic bed of coals. The oak log, which had been a rough-barked cylinder of wood hours ago, was now a glowing sculpture of pure heat. It retained its shape, a ghost log made of incandescent charcoal, pulsing with a deep, blood-red rhythm. It did not crackle. It did not pop. It simply radiated. The heat it threw was infrared, invisible to the eye but felt by the skin as a steady, nourishing pressure. It traveled across the room in silent waves, washing over the furniture, drying the herbs, and settling into the furs of the bed. The light in the room was minimal, a faint, subterranean twilight. The red glow from the coals painted the hearthstones in shades of rusted iron and dried blood. It caught the edges of the andirons, turning them into silhouettes of black metal against the deep red. Further out into the room, the light failed, swallowed by the blue-gray gloom. The table was a vague plateau of darkness. The chair was a skeletal shape waiting in the void. The hanging bundles of dried plants were stalactites descending from the ceiling, motionless and mysterious. The visual quality of the scene was soft, blurred, like a charcoal drawing rubbed with a thumb to erase the sharp lines. The healer lay beneath the mound of furs, a landscape of stillness. The breathing had become so shallow, so slow, that it was indistinguishable from the ambient air currents of the room. The chest rose and fell with a glacial slowness, a movement that took seconds to complete. The air entered the body, performed its vital exchange, and departed, leaving no trace but a faint warmth on the pillow. The heart, that tireless drum, beat with a heavy, deliberate thud, echoing the slow pulse of the coals. Thud. Pause. Pause. Thud. It was the rhythm of hibernation, the metabolic tempo of the bear in the cave, the frog in the mud. The cold had crept closer. It had found the gaps in the chinking, the thin spots in the glass, the space under the door. It lay on the floorboards, a layer of dense, freezing air that hovered inches above the wood. It was a patient besieger. It did not attack, it waited. It waited for the fire to die, for the blood to cool. But the fire held. The bed held. The boundary between the life and the freeze was maintained, a stalemate negotiated by wool and wood and stone. On the table, the harvest of the day lay in the dark, undergoing its own silent transmutation. The willow bark, stripped from the living tree in the biting wind of the creek, was curling in upon itself. The moisture was leaving the cells, evaporating into the dry air of the cabin. As it dried, the bark tightened, turning from green and pliable to brown and brittle. It was becoming medicine. The pain-killing salicin was concentrating, locking itself into the fibers, waiting for the future fever, the future ache. The roots of the marshmallow, sliced into pale discs, were shrinking on the drying screen. They had lost their slimy, wet texture and were becoming hard, bone-like chips. They smelled faintly of the swamp, of the deep earth, a scent that mingled with the wood smoke. In the dark, they looked like ancient coins scattered on a cloth. They were stored energy, the summer sun trapped in starch, harvested from the frozen mud and brought into the sanctuary. The winter berries in the bowl were dark, hard beads. They had not shriveled yet. They held their shape, tiny spheres of frozen red juice. They watched the room with 100 tiny reflections of the coal glow on their skins. They were the blood of the winter, the spark of color in a monochromatic world. The boot stood by the hearth, empty and heavy. The leather, which had been soaked and frozen, was now drying slowly. The beeswax and tallow dressing gave off a faint animal scent. They looked like the feet of an invisible giant standing guard over the fire. They retained the shape of the healer's feet, the creases in the ankles, the spread of the toes. They were resting. The mud of the fen, dried and caked in the treads of the soles, was turning to dust, falling in microscopic grains onto the hearth rug. The history of the walk was crumbling away, returning to the earth. The cloak hung on its peg, a dark, vertical shadow against the log wall. It was dry now, the meltwater evaporated. The wool was stiff, heavy with the lanolin and the dirt of the forest. It looked like a pelt, a skin shed by a large beast. It held the smell of the wind, the ozone of the ridge, the resin of the pine. It was the shield, the shell, waiting for the next dawn, for the next venture into the storm. The silence in the room was not empty. It was filled with the minute sounds of the drying and the cooling, the shifting of a log, the rustle of a drying leaf, the tick of the cooling iron kettle. These sounds were the vocabulary of the night. They were comforting, domestic, eternal. They whispered that the house was functioning, that the system was working. Outside, the moon had set. The silver light that had washed the valley was gone, replaced by the deep, absolute black of the star field. The sky was a dome of obsidian, pierced by the hard, cold points of the distant suns. The Milky Way was a river of ice overhead, a bridge of dust and light that spanned the horizon. The constellations wheeled slowly, marking the passage of the hours with a celestial geometry that cared nothing for the cold or the warmth. The wind had died down completely. The air in the valley was still, frozen into a solid block of crystal clarity. The temperature had bottomed out. The trees stood motionless, their branches stiff and brittle. The sap inside them was solid ice. They were statues of wood enduring the stress of the freeze. If a branch were to break now, it would sound like a gunshot, a sharp crack that would travel for miles in the silence. But nothing broke. The forest held its breath. The river, flowing beneath the ice, was the only thing moving. In the black depth under the thick white roof, the water continued its journey to the sea. It flowed silently, sliding over the rocks, carrying the sleeping fish, the dormant frogs, the seeds of the water plants. It was the artery of the valley, the hidden pulse that never stopped. The healer in the deep sleep was connected to this flow. The blood in the veins moved with the same slow, hydraulic persistence. The frost on the window pane had grown thick. It was no longer just a pattern of ferns, it was a geology. Ridges and valleys of ice had formed on the glass, building up layer by layer as the moisture in the room met the cold of the night. It blocked the view of the outside world completely. The cabin was sealed. There was no outside. There was only the inside. The room was a universe unto itself, self-contained and complete. The healer's mind was a blank slate, washed clean by the exhaustion and the sleep. There were no dreams now. The rapid eye movement had ceased. The brain had descended into the delta waves, the slow, rolling ocean of deep unconsciousness. Here there was no identity. There was no healer, no gatherer, no name. There was only the biological imperative to exist, to repair, to store energy. The muscles of the legs, torn and battered by the climb, were knitting themselves back together. The skin of the face, burned by the wind, was soothing itself. The immune system was patrolling the blood, fortified by the rest. This was the sleep of the winter. It was not a pause in life, it was a state of being. It was the human equivalent of the tree's dormancy. It was a shedding of the unnecessary, a focusing on the core. The worries of the summer, the garden, the repairs, the harvest were gone. The worries of the day, the cold, the wind, the pain were gone. There was only the now, the warm bed, the dark room, the beating heart. The fire in the hearth shifted. The oak log, consumed from within, broke apart gently. It separated into two glowing halves, exposing the intense, orange-white center. A flare of heat released into the room, a final surge of warmth to carry the sleeper through the pre-dawn hours. The light brightened momentarily, casting long, moving shadows that swung across the ceiling like the pendulum of a clock, then settled back into the deep red glow. The dust motes in the air, illuminated by this brief flare, danced in the thermal currents. They were tiny stars in the galaxy of the room, rising on the heat, falling in the cool air near the floor. They spun and drifted, silent and weightless. They were composed of the ash of the fire, the dust of the herbs, the fibers of the wool. They were the microscopic debris of the life lived in this room, suspended in the stillness. The smell of the room changed subtly as the night wore on. The sharp scent of the drying willow faded, replaced by the deeper, sweeter smell of the marsh mallow roots. The wood smoke scent became stale, a heavy, comfortable blanket of odor that signaled safety. The smell of the beeswax candle, extinguished hours ago, lingered as a faint memory of honey. The sensory landscape was stable, consistent, known. The healer turned in the sleep, a slow, heavy roll to the side. The furs rustled, a sound like dry leaves in a forest. The shoulder settled into the mattress. The hand curled near the face, the fingers relaxed and open. The breathing did not change rhythm. In, out, the continuity was unbroken. The darkness seemed to stretch out, elongating the minutes into hours. There was no rush. The sun was far away on the other side of the world. The dawn was a distant promise, not a demand. The night belonged to the sleeper. It was a kingdom of quiet, ruled by the laws of rest. In the corner of the room, a spider, dormant for the winter in its web behind the wardrobe, sensed the warmth. It remained still, legs tucked in, a tiny ball of life waiting for the spring. A mouse, nestled in the insulation of the ceiling, slept in a ball of dried grass, its heart beating fast but its body still. The cabin was a vessel of sleeping lives, a wooden ark floating on the sea of the freeze. The cold outside pressed harder as the night reached its absolute nadir. The temperature dropped that final degree, reaching the limit of the thermometer. The nails in the logs popped with a sharp ping. The sound was loud in the room, but the healer did not wake. The sound was part of the house. It was the house tightening its muscles against the cold. It was a sound of strength. The silence returned, deeper than before. It was a silence that had weight and texture. It felt ancient, as if this silence had occupied this valley for 1,000,000 years, interrupted only briefly by the wind and the footsteps of the healer. Now that the movement had stopped, the silence reclaimed its territory. It filled the cup of the valley, and the cabin was a bubble of air at the bottom of the ocean. The healer's consciousness was a small, warm light deep within the body. It did not think, it merely felt. It felt the warmth of the quilt. It felt the solidity of the bed. It felt the absence of pain. It felt the satisfaction of the full larder. It felt the rightness of the rest. This was the reward. The struggle of the walk, the agony of the cold. It was all paid for by this moment of absolute peace. The timeline of the night blurred. Was it hours? Was it years? It did not matter. The sleep was the only reality. The waking world was a dream, a distant, noisy hallucination. The true world was this, the dark, the warmth, the quiet. The fire burned down further. The coals began to coat themselves in a layer of fine gray ash. The light dimmed to a faint, bloody pulse. The heat output lowered, but the room held the warmth. The heavy logs of the walls had absorbed the heat all evening and now radiated it back, acting as a thermal battery. The cabin protected its inhabitant. The frost on the window thickened, turning opaque white. The moonlight, if it had been there, would not have penetrated. The darkness was sealed in. The healer slept. The chest rose, the chest fell, the heart beat, the blood flowed. The cycle continued. There was no end to the night, not yet. There was only the duration, the endurance, the long, slow wait for the turning of the wheel. But here, in the center of the dark, in the center of the cold, there was a perfect, warm stillness. A pause in the sentence of existence. A breath held. A peace that passed all understanding. The forest healer gathered strength in the frost, silent and still, wrapped in the vintage colors of the dark room, while the wind whispered the history of the winter to the trees outside. And the sleep went on, and the silence held, and the night was long and cold and perfect.